Hey guys, tonight we're going to time travel to a world that's about as far from romanticised fantasy novels as it gets. Forget the flower crowns and candlelit castles. Tonight, we're slipping behind the heavy oak doors of medieval bedrooms, convents and back alleys to uncover what sex was really like for medieval girls. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your city and the time you're listening in the comments. I love seeing where in the world you're winding down from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, you're born. You're a baby girl in, say, 1320 England, and the midwife already knows something about your future. It's going to involve blood, babies, and being told no a lot. Maybe you were lucky enough to be born into a noble family. Silk blankets, a wet nurse, and eventually a well-planned marriage. Or maybe you're the daughter of a baker swaddled in scratchy linen, with your parents already whispering how many eggs they might get in a dowry if they pair you off right. Either way, the moment you're swaddled in cloth, you're being measured, not just by weight and lung power, but by future potential. You're not a person, not quite. You're a promise, a political pawn, a little body with a countdown timer toward utility, and medieval society had a system. That system was layered like an onion and smelled kind of like one too. Gender wasn't just a social role, it was a fate. A girl was expected to embody obedience, chastity and silence, and none of those were metaphors. They were concrete, enforceable expectations. Like literal laws existed around this stuff. As you grow, you're constantly reminded of your position. Boys might be allowed to run in the mud and throw rocks, but your place is indoors, learning to sew, to serve, maybe to pray, definitely to keep your legs closed and your mouth even more so. From your earliest years, there are whisperings of your eventual role, not as a free individual, but as someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's mother, never just someone. You're 5 and being taught how to keep your hair covered, because exposed hair is temptation. You're 7 and being told not to look men in the eye too long, lest you invite sin. You're 10 and already hearing about girls younger than you being married off for their protection. Protection, in this case, often means controlling their sexuality before it even awakens. There's a chilling efficiency to how medieval society prepped girls for their future. No one was waiting for puberty to start sexualizing them. Oh no, that ship set sail much earlier. By the time you understand what your body even is, everyone else has already decided what it's for. It wasn't just your family setting these expectations. The church loomed like a thundercloud, casting shadows into every crevice of life. Priests didn't just preach salvation, they regulated morality, behaviour, and even what happened in bedrooms. Their sermons weren't just about hell and heaven, they were about how girls should dress, how they should act, and what would happen if they stepped out of line. Spoiler, it wasn't good. And here's a fun historical fact to sit with. Girls as young as 7 could be betrothed legally. That's not a typo. 7. The age when your biggest concern should be not stepping on a Lego. Now, marriage wouldn't usually be consummated until puberty, but puberty was a flexible term. You started bleeding? Cool, time to make a baby. Meanwhile, education was a luxury most girls didn't get. Unless you were nobility or entering a convent, literacy wasn't considered necessary. Why teach a girl to read when she wouldn't be writing contracts or reading scripture on her own? Nope, her future was written for her by others. And yet, even within this web of restriction, medieval girls weren't passive dolls. They picked up on everything. How their mothers adjusted their speech when men entered the room. How older sisters got suddenly quiet when someone brought up a marriage match. They learned survival through silence, rebellion through subtlety. A lowered gaze, a turned shoulder, a faked illness. Little acts of resistance in a world that offered them almost no control. Let's talk about one such girl, historical fact incoming, Marjorie Kemper. Born around 1373 in England, she wasn't exactly your average medieval girl, but she gives us insight. She claimed to have visions of Christ, and rather than quietly become a nun, she dictated one of the first autobiographies in the English language. The woman was a chaotic mix of religious ecstasy and holy rebellion. She had 14 kids, but eventually swore celibacy from her husband and dedicated herself to God. But here's the twist. People didn't always see her as a saint. They saw her as a nuisance, a threat, a woman speaking too much, too loudly. And speaking of unexpected medieval moments, here's your quirky fact of the night. Some communities believed that a woman's body was cold and passive by nature, and that sex literally warmed her into fertility. So yes, medieval science thought women were like sourdough, needed heat to rise. Meanwhile, scholars today still debate how common girlhood marriages actually were across regions. Sure, the law allowed them, but the reality on the ground varied a lot. In rural areas, practical concerns, like needing hands on the farm, might delay marriage. In wealthier circles, the urgency was different. It was about sealing alliances, not just fertility. So even though the stereotype of the preteen bride is rooted in truth, it wasn't a universal experience. The debate continues: how much was law and how much was lived? But across the board, one thing was certain. Being born a girl in the Middle Ages wasn't a gentle affair. Your identity was shaped by others before you could shape it yourself. Your future was a transaction wrapped in lace, prayers and expectations. And you had no idea that the worst and the weirdest was still to come. You're around 11 now, maybe 12, old enough to have seen a lamb slaughtered and to know what blood smells like when it isn't yours. You've started to understand that the adults watch you differently these days. When you bend down to gather herbs, when you walk past the blacksmith shop, there's a new awareness, a shift. You're still a child, but the world has stopped treating you like one. Because here it is. Your virginity is officially valuable now, not in some poetic spiritual sense. No, it's worth land, livestock, maybe even a political alliance if your family's ambitious enough. Virginity isn't a personal matter, it's currency, a form of wealth. And guess what? You don't even get to hold the purse. They don't ask if you feel ready. Readiness isn't part of the equation. What matters is timing, that delicate balance between physical maturity and social opportunity. Your family knows that a good match, especially for someone like you from the merchant class or minor nobility, can elevate everyone's standing. You're not just a girl, you're an investment. At the heart of this obsession with virginity is one very particular belief, that a woman once deflowered loses more than just physical innocence. She loses value. Her body becomes a used item, tainted. And if she isn't married when it happens, the stain is permanent. It doesn't wash off, no matter how many Ave Marias are whispered in a candlelit corner. So let's talk about the hymen. Oh yes, even in the 1300s, this tiny piece of tissue held an entire girl's future in its metaphorical hands. There were actual medical texts that attempted to classify the proper signs of virginity: pale skin, soft voice, modesty, and of course an unbroken hymen. Never mind that some girls are born without one. Never mind that horseback riding, tree climbing, or, existing could ruin it. If a girl was married and didn't bleed on the wedding night, panic, suspicion, in extreme cases, annulment. In some regions, a stained bedsheet was hung from the window as public proof of virtue. And yes, there were times when midwives or mothers helped the process along, with a prick of the finger or a drop of animal blood. It was part survival, part theatre, and 100% pressure. Your virginity was talked about like a prize, but it was really a contract, a guarantee. And here's the kicker. While the church praised it, nobles and kings routinely ignored it when it suited them. There are records of high-ranking men, some even considered pious, keeping preteen mistresses. It wasn't just normalised, it was brushed off as natural male appetite. Meanwhile, if a girl was assaulted and couldn't prove it was without her consent, she might be punished instead of her attacker. It's as if the moment you were born female, you entered a lifetime of being held responsible for someone else's actions. And speaking of church contradictions, here's your historical fact of the night. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council declared that priests could no longer perform virginity tests or force confessions on girls suspected of premarital sex. Sounds progressive, right? But the underlying belief that a girl's sexual status defined her worth didn't budge. The policy just meant the policing got sneakier and more private. Here's something weirder. Some families actually hired women known as matrons to inspect potential brides, not to ensure they were healthy or kind or intelligent, just to ensure they were physically intact. It's like a meat market, but instead of checking for bruises on fruit, you're checking for moral purity via anatomy. Can you imagine being 15 and forced to lift your skirts for an old woman with a candle and a grim expression? And if you're thinking, surely some people question this system, yes, but quietly. Female poets and mystics sometimes hinted at the unfairness of it all. A few male scholars debated whether purity was really just a social construct, but those debates stayed tucked inside monastic libraries, far away from the village square. The dominant narrative: virginity equals virtue, and a girl's job is to preserve it like fine wine until a man decides to uncork it. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, girls whispered to each other. Some shared secrets passed down from older sisters: how to fake shyness, how to avoid a suitor's eye without offending him, how to drop hints about illness to delay a wedding. These weren't just girlish games, they were tactics, defense mechanisms, strategies for survival in a world that offered no pause button, no not yet, and certainly no no. And yes, there were girls who defied the expectations. There were cases, rare but real, of women who chose not to marry. Sometimes they fled to convents, where they could trade the demands of virginity for the more complicated freedom of spiritual devotion. Other times they simply vanished, disappeared into towns under assumed names, working as spinners or healers. But even then their virginity haunted them like a ghost. Because whether you offered it up or kept it locked away, everyone still felt entitled to know. Which brings us to an unsettling scholarly debate. How much of the virginity narrative was actually enforced, and how much was mythologized later? Some historians argue that the obsession was mostly limited to upper classes and church circles, that peasants were far more pragmatic. If a farm girl got pregnant, it was a problem, sure, but not necessarily a life-ending scandal. Others believe the pressure trickled down through gossip, sermons, and superstition, until even the poorest mother taught her daughter to guard her body like it was a cursed treasure chest. Regardless of class, though, you can't escape the message. Your body doesn't belong to you. It's a symbol, a tool, a bargaining chip. And the truly twisted part? You're supposed to feel proud of that. You're supposed to treat your own restriction as a badge of honour. So you walk a tightrope. You wear your hair covered. You keep your voice soft. You smile at the right times and never linger too long near the stables. You dream sometimes, quietly, guiltily, about something else. About freedom. About a future that doesn't hinge on whether someone thinks you're pure. But the world isn't interested in your dreams. Not yet. It's only interested in your hymen. You don't get to decide what's holy. That's already been decided for you, by old men in robes who have never touched a woman and think that's a good thing. The church is the air you breathe, the voice in your ear, and the ceiling over your bed. It watches you with stained glass eyes and tells you who you're supposed to be before you've had a chance to figure it out for yourself. Spoiler, you're not supposed to be curious, or loud, or sexual. You're supposed to be good. And good girls keep their heads down and their legs closed. By now you've heard all the sermons. Even if you're half asleep in the pew or kneeling with numb knees on a cold stone floor, the words still get through. Lust is a sin. Pride is a sin. Temptation. Basically a gateway to eternal damnation. And who's the biggest source of temptation according to the local friar? That's right, you. Women are Eve, the original sinners, the reason humanity was booted out of paradise. You're 12, and already carrying the guilt of the fall of man. No pressure. But it's not just the sermons, it's the art, it's the songs, the rules etched into the way people talk and walk and look at you. There's this constant invisible checklist. Are your sleeves long enough? Are your ankles showing? Are you looking too closely at that boy near the market square? The message is clear. Your body is dangerous. It could lead men astray, and that makes you responsible for their sins. The weird thing is you start to internalize it, not because you believe it necessarily, but because it's everywhere, like background music that slowly becomes a lullaby. You start judging yourself before anyone else gets the chance. You flinch at your own reflection. You second-guess every laugh, every glance, every instinct. Because somewhere deep down, you're being taught to see yourself the way the church does, as a ticking time bomb of temptation. Let's zoom in on confession. Oh yes, the weekly soul scrub. It's supposed to be about spiritual cleansing, but for girls, it often becomes something else entirely. You step into the dark booth, kneel on the hard wood and whisper your sins into a little mesh window. And what counts as a sin? Thinking about a boy, touching yourself under your blanket, even dreaming something you can't control. The priest, who by the way, is usually an older man who's heard it all, asks questions, sometimes very detailed ones, and you're supposed to answer honestly, even if you're blushing so hard your ears feel like they're on fire. This is where things get murky. Some confessions were truly sacred, a release, a way for girls to feel a flicker of grace in a brutal world. But others? Let's just say not every priest was a saint. There are recorded complaints, quiet ones, about clergy who use confession as a way to indulge in other people's secrets, especially young girls. Sometimes girls were even told that the confession itself was a kind of penance, that the shame they felt talking about these things was holy. And here's your historical fact for the night. In the 14th century, the Church began to standardize confession manuals, literal guides for priests on what sins to ask about and how to phrase questions. One infamous manual, written by a Dominican friar, contained explicit inquiries about sexual acts, including the positions used, whether climax was achieved, and if both parties enjoyed it. Just imagine that. You're 13, whispering your confused, sweaty thoughts into a screen, and the priest is flipping through a guidebook like it's a menu. Meanwhile, the Church's grip went beyond the chapel. Canon law influenced civil law. That meant what the Church believed about sex, especially women's sex, could become the basis for actual punishment. Adultery, whipping, premarital sex, public penance, maybe even exile. But if a man seduced a young girl, sometimes all he had to do was marry her and it was fine. Her violation, repackaged as a dowry-free marriage. There's a fringe detail for you. In some regions, if a girl was sexually active out of wedlock, even against her will, she was considered spoiled goods and became less likely to be believed in court. Worse still, some areas had reconciliation customs where victims were pressured to marry their attackers to restore honour. Sounds medieval? Because it is. At the same time, not everyone agreed on everything. There were actually debates, fierce ones, about female sexuality in scholarly circles. Some theologians believed that women were naturally more lustful, citing Eve and her apple-fueled curiosity. Others argued women were more passive, more spiritual, and less carnal by nature. This wasn't just an academic squabble. It shaped how laws were written, how confessions were framed, and how punishments were handed down. But here's the twist. While the Church preached about purity, it quietly tolerated the existence of brothels in many towns. Why? Because it was considered the lesser evil. Better, they thought, to have controlled spaces for male lust than to risk them preying on virtuous girls. You're 13, hearing this double standard play out in real time. Your worth is in your chastity, but some other girl is being sacrificed to keep society running. And if you're unlucky enough to fall outside the lines, you might become that girl. Meanwhile, nuns were held up as the pinnacle of feminine virtue, pure, untouched, married to Christ himself. But convents weren't always the pious bubbles people imagined. There were scandals, affairs, secret pregnancies, even same-sex relationships, some of which were exposed in inquisitorial records centuries later. The Church tried to keep these stories buried, but the reality leaked through in whispers, diaries, and disciplinary reports. And yet, despite all this noise, despite the lectures, the fear, the constant shame, girls still had thoughts, still had questions, still felt things they couldn't name. Some snuck kisses in the shadows of abbey walls, some carved hearts into tree trunks, some listened to older girls talk about sex in stolen fragments. Half true, half terrifying. No one taught them about it, of course. But curiosity, that's hard to kill. And you, our imaginary medieval girl, you're living in this tension, torn between what you've been told and what your body is quietly suggesting, between sermons and sensations, between fear and wonder. You feel guilty for even wanting to understand, but the silence around you only makes the questions louder. You don't dare ask them out loud, so you fold them up and tuck them away, somewhere deep, where even God maybe can't find them. It starts with a stain, just a little spot in your underclothes one morning, rust-coloured and unfamiliar. You don't panic, yet, but something in your gut shifts. You know what this is. Your mother, or an aunt, or maybe the old midwife with eyes like cloudy glass told you it would come. The curse, they called it, as if your body has done something wrong by blooming. You're 12, maybe 13, or younger. The timing doesn't really matter. What matters is that now you're of age. Of age for what exactly? Marriage, pregnancy, social scrutiny dialed up to 11. It's no longer hypothetical. You've moved into the next category. Puberty is not a private journey in the Middle Ages. It's a public alert. Your body is now everyone's business. Your mother notices first, of course. There's no hiding it in a one-room home. She might say nothing. She might pull you aside and hand you a rag, soft linen if you're lucky, scratchy wool if not, and instruct you how to fold it properly, how to rinse it in secret. But she doesn't smile. She doesn't celebrate. She looks at you with a kind of resignation, maybe even worry. You're officially ready, and readiness is dangerous. Because here's what this moment really means. You're now vulnerable in a way you weren't before. Not just physically, but socially. You can bear children, and that means the world stops treating you like a child, even if you still are one. The neighbourhood women may begin to include you in their gossip, half welcome, half warning. Men, older ones, might look a second too long. They're sizing up what you don't yet understand. In some towns, girls were betrothed before this point, but bleeding changes everything. Betrothal becomes urgency. Your family wants to protect you, of course. But protection doesn't mean giving you space to grow. It means getting you married. Quickly, quietly, and with as much advantage as possible. The goal? Transfer you from your father's house to your husband's before anything bad happens. Bad in this case, meaning any hint of scandal, a flirtation, a pregnancy, a rumour. Let's say your family is middling, not noble, but not dirt poor. That gives you some leverage. You might get a choice between two suitors, both older men with calloused hands and decent coin. Or maybe just one, who smells like barley and barely makes eye contact. Either way, your input is limited. You're allowed to nod, to stay silent, but rarely to say no. Historically speaking, noble families sometimes had marriage contracts drawn up when a girl was barely out of toddlerhood, with the understanding that the match would be sealed after her first period. The logic was economic. Daughters were assets. Virgin daughters, even more so. There are recorded cases of girls being married off at 12 or 13, some even younger, though consummation was supposed to wait until physical maturity. Supposed to, but maturity was loosely defined. The onset of menstruation was considered the green light, even if the girl's body was still narrow-hipped and fragile. Medical understanding at the time was somewhere between wild guesswork and pure fantasy. One physician swore that menstrual blood, if not released through intercourse or childbirth, could poison a girl's brain. Others believed that women's bodies were naturally cold and moist, requiring the heat of a man's body to achieve balance. Translation: if you're bleeding, you need to be breeding. Here's a bizarre historical fact to digest while you sit with that. Some medieval doctors believed that menstruation was simply the body's way of ridding itself of excess humours. That meant if you had irregular periods, you were either ill or sinful. Women were told not to touch crops, bread dough, or even mirrors while menstruating, lest they spoil or crack them with their impure presence. And because superstition always goes hand in hand with medicine, girls were advised to avoid bathing during their period for fear the blood would reverse course and damage the internal organs. Instead, you might be told to drink wine boiled with leeks to balance the womb. You're welcome for that mental image. So now you're not only bleeding, you're being told your bleeding makes you dangerous, untouchable. Your body is both sacred and shameful, a temple and a hazard, and of course no one explains any of this clearly. You get pieces, quiet instructions, vague threats, maybe a whispered joke between older girls that makes no sense to you. The full picture never arrives. You're left to build it yourself, one half-truth at a time. Once you're of age, even more changes. You're expected to cover your head in public if you weren't already. You might be pulled from household chores to learn the tasks of a wife, how to manage a kitchen, how to tend a husband's wounds, how to obey. If your betrothal is already arranged, now is when the pressure ramps up. You're taught to be submissive, to walk behind your future husband in public, and to speak only when spoken to. You start practicing your new name, practicing not flinching when older men stare. There's a debate among historians about just how young consummation happened in practice. While church law recommended waiting until a girl was around 14, enforcement was loose at best. In rural areas, cultural norms often prevailed over canon law. Some say most men did wait. Others argue that power, money and lust often overrode patience. Either way, the girl didn't get to decide. And that's the darkest truth here. You're old enough to be married, but not old enough to understand what marriage means. You're old enough to bleed, but not old enough to consent. The world sees your body as mature because of one biological event, but your mind is still catching up. You're a child with a calendar that just flipped too fast. Girls your age might respond in different ways. Some get quiet, withdraw. Others try to play along, mimicking older women, smiling at suitors, performing the role they've been trained for. Some rebel in small ways, refusing to wash, hiding their rags, speaking out of turn. But the consequences of rebellion are sharp. Disobedience can be read as moral failure, even witchcraft. There's little room for grey area. Still, within this strange new chapter, there's one thread of shared experience. Sisterhood. Other girls who've bled before you will notice. Maybe one will slip you extra cloth. Another might whisper, "It's not so bad after the first time." They form a quiet network, tiny acts of kindness in a system designed to isolate you. You never forget the day your body made that first announcement, because from then on, every decision about your clothes, your behaviour, your future, gets filtered through it. You're not a girl anymore, not really. You're potential, you're property, you're at risk. And the scariest part? You're just getting started. You've known him for maybe 3 afternoons, most of which involved awkward silence and your mother hovering just outside earshot. He doesn't talk much, this betrothed of yours. He's not cruel, at least not yet. He seems decent, smells like horsehair and beer, and he offered you a plum once without making a joke about your figure. So, that's something. But it doesn't really matter whether he's nice. You're 13, maybe 14, and what matters is that someone wants you, publicly, officially. His family has some property, your father needs the alliance, and the contract was drawn up with a wax seal and a handshake between men who won't be the ones sleeping in the same bed. It's done, and now you're someone's future wife. Or, as the church would phrase it, your soul is now preparing to transition to the duties of matrimony. Romantic, isn't it? In reality, this part of your life is less about love and more about negotiation. Betrothals were business transactions, and girlhood was often reduced to a bargaining chip. Your age, your virginity, your father's harvest last season, it all factored in. Dowries weren't just tradition, they were leverage. Some girls were literally swapped for land, livestock or political favours. A good match wasn't measured in happiness but in acreage. This was where it got messy. Because despite how official these arrangements were, they weren't always final. Engagements could be broken if someone offered a better deal. That made you vulnerable not just emotionally but economically. You were a commodity with an expiration date, and any hint of scandal, real or rumoured, could ruin your value overnight. And here's a grim little detail. Betrothals could be legally binding. In some cases, if a couple exchanged certain vows, even without witnesses, the church could consider them married. There are actual court records from the 1300s where girls claimed coercion or misunderstanding, but if a priest heard the right words, too bad. Congratulations, you're now legally someone's wife, even if you didn't mean to be. So what's your role during all this? Smile, embroider, practice saying his name, sit quietly while your father talks about your purity like it's a bushel of wheat. Your mother gives you a bit of advice, probably more practical than poetic. Don't argue, keep the sheets clean, try to give him sons. Maybe if she's feeling bold, she warns you that the wedding night will hurt, but that it won't last forever. But here's where things start to crack around the edges, because between the trading and the silence and the white-knuckled modesty, something strange emerges. Flirtation. Not the fun, sparkly kind from fairy tales. This was subtler, more dangerous. You might meet his eyes a moment too long. He might brush your hand at the feast. Maybe you sneak a note, ink-smeared, rushed lines about how you hope he's kind. These tiny gestures feel enormous and risky, because even though you're betrothed, people are still watching. One wrong look and tongues will wag, and wag they did. In many medieval communities, betrothal didn't automatically grant you sexual permission. Consummation was supposed to wait until the wedding, but not everyone waited. And if things went too far before vows were exchanged, that could ruin everything. If you got pregnant during the betrothal period, it could trigger a scandal that rippled through both families. Sometimes it led to rushed weddings, sometimes to public shame, sometimes to abandonment. Let's not forget, a betrothal didn't always mean affection. Sometimes it was made without your consent, sometimes without your knowledge. Girls were promised while still nursing dolls, only to find out later that their future had already been sealed. You might be sent to live in your future husband's household as a sort of practice wife, helping with chores, learning how to behave, like an unpaid intern whose job ends in lifelong servitude. Historical fact time. The church tried to regulate betrothals with varying success. Canon law insisted that marriage required free consent from both parties, but free was loosely interpreted. A nod under family pressure still counted. And guess what? Girls as young as 12 could legally give that consent. It's one of those, on paper it sounds like a right, but in reality it's just a loophole kinds of laws. And then there's the fringe stuff. In some regions there were actually community rituals that resembled games, where young people engaged in courtship play. Think spring festivals, fertility dances, things that blurred the line between innocence and innuendo. In some cases these rituals were used to test compatibility, socially, sexually, spiritually. But of course, girls were still expected to draw the line before things got physical. Boys? They got winks and shoulder pats. You got threats and lectures. Even in your inner circle, things are complicated. Other girls are watching you. Some are jealous. Some pity you. Some whisper horror stories about older sisters whose husbands were cruel or cold or simply boring. You try not to think about it. You focus on the cloth in your lap, the stitches in your embroidery, the way your betrothed says your name without choking on it. But the fear is there, humming beneath everything. You've seen what happens when things go wrong. You know about the girl down the road, Maud, maybe, who ran off with a peddler and came back pregnant, only to vanish mysteriously a few weeks later. You remember the old midwife muttering something about dishonour, while the men shook their heads and looked away. And here's the scholarly debate for tonight. How much agency did girls really have in these arrangements? Some historians argue that noble women, at least, sometimes influenced their matches through diplomacy, family alliances, or charm. Others insist that girls of any class had almost no say. The truth probably lies in the middle, a narrow window of influence surrounded by walls made of duty and fear. What no one talks about, at least not in daylight, is the emotional whiplash. One day you're playing in the fields, the next you're practicing how to kneel beside a man and call him husband. You go from child to bride with no pause in between. There's no coming-of-age ceremony, no sacred rite to help you cross the threshold. Just a betrothal contract and the ticking clock of everyone's expectations. And somewhere inside you, the question lingers, what if you don't want this? What if love doesn't arrive like it does in the ballads? What if your body says no when the world says yes? But no one's asking, the deal's already struck, you're already promised. Now you just have to survive it. The wedding isn't for you, not really. It's for your family, for your husband's kin, for the neighbours and the priest and anyone who needs visual proof that your body is officially changing hands. You're dressed like a relic on display, hair braided and covered just so, embroidered sleeves tied tight at the wrists, a ribbon at your waist to symbolise chastity. You don't wear white, that's a modern thing. You wear colour. Red if your family's bold, blue if they're aiming for pious, or maybe green if your father's a little drunk on tradition and wants to flaunt fertility like a proud harvest. You don't get to choose the dress, you barely get to speak during the ceremony. You kneel, you murmur your lines, you keep your hands folded the way your mother taught you, fingers tight, palms dry, no fidgeting. You don't look him in the eyes, not yet, that comes later. The priest reads the rites in Latin. You don't understand most of it, but the meaning is clear. You are now one flesh. You belong to each other. But let's not kid ourselves. You belong to him. This is less about union and more about transfer. Your dowry passes from your father's ledgers to your husband's estate. You're the package that came with the coins. Some girls cry, quietly, behind veils. Others stand stiff as boards, blinking straight ahead, refusing to give the crowd the satisfaction of seeing fear. A few even smile, if they've lucked into a kind match, or been raised on the fantasy that this moment is the start of something magical. But beneath the garlands and the feasting, everyone knows what this is. A transaction sealed with wine, witnesses, and an upcoming act of consummation. And here's where it takes a strange turn. Because as much as the church talked up the holiness of marriage, they were also obsessed with making sure the sex was done. Legally, spiritually, physically. The wedding wasn't fully valid until the union was consummated. That meant the first night wasn't just personal, it was political. A body had to confirm the contract. In some places there were witnesses, not in the room exactly, though sometimes, yes, even that, but hovering just outside the bedchamber door. Mothers, priests, aunts, servants, people waiting to hear the sounds of completion, to collect the bloodied sheets, to confirm the bride was intact and the act had occurred. If the evidence was missing, questions followed. In noble families, this could mean lawsuits, annulments, even war. For common folk, it meant shame, gossip, maybe the priest coming back around to offer some encouragement. Your historical fact tonight is one of those that's equal parts horrifying and bizarre. In 15th century France, noble marriages could include a ritual known as the bedding ceremony, where the bride and groom were led to bed by a crowd of onlookers. Yes, a crowd, who cheered and offered advice. The newlyweds might be expected to lie naked under the covers while wine was passed around. Then the guests left, leaving the couple to do what needed doing. Sleep tight. If that sounds mortifying, you're not wrong. The pressure wasn't just social, it was legal. If your husband couldn't perform, he could be sued for impotence. There were even court cases where men had to demonstrate their abilities to a panel of judges and physicians. Meanwhile, if the wife didn't bleed, it raised suspicions of infidelity, whether or not it was true. Virginity had to be proven, not just assumed. And here's the darkest part. You don't get a say. Consent in medieval marriage was not a thing. Once you were wed, your body was considered your husband's right. If he wanted you, you were expected to comply. Even church doctrine, which could occasionally be surprisingly progressive on issues like mutual respect, still firmly stated that sex within marriage was a duty. For both partners, technically, but we all know who was expected to do the pleasing and who was allowed to demand. Some women tried to delay, they faked illness, claimed headaches, cried, but delays could only go so far. The consummation had to happen, and when it did, it was often confusing, painful, and deeply disorienting. Girls raised to think of their bodies as sacred and untouchable were suddenly expected to open their legs and endure something no one had properly explained. And no, there was no talk beforehand. No hand-holding moment of soft education. If you were lucky, an older woman may have muttered a few tips. Keep still, breathe through it, pretend to sleep. Others weren't so lucky. They found out what sex was in real time with a man climbing on top of them and calling it love. Which leads us to the fringe fact of the night. There are medieval letters and folk songs that suggest some girls did experience pleasure in their early marriages, but only when the husband was gentle, and when trust grew with time. These moments were rare and rarely celebrated. Female desire was viewed with suspicion, even within marriage. If a woman seemed to enjoy sex too much, she could be labelled unnatural, a wanton, a sinner. Women were supposed to endure sex, not seek it. Still, the records don't lie. Some women found ways to reclaim a sliver of agency. They used herbs to dull pain or delay pregnancy. They shared knowledge in kitchens and convents and quiet corners, swapping secrets about bodies and feelings and how to survive. Some even learned to manipulate desire, using it as a form of influence. But for most, the first night wasn't about pleasure. It was about performance, about survival. There's still debate among scholars about just how widespread this ritualized scrutiny was. Some argue that only the nobility were subjected to bed checks and bloodstains. Others insist that in tight-knit village communities even peasants had ways of enforcing the rules, through gossip, shaming and pressure. Either way, the bride bore the burden of proof. Her body, her blood, her responsibility. So now it's you, lying in a bed that isn't yours beside a man you barely know. The room smells like candle wax and stale beer. The sheets are scratchy. Your heart is pounding, your stomach a knot. Somewhere outside, someone is waiting to hear a sound, see a sign. You think of the girl you used to be, playing by the stream, laughing in your mother's arms. That girl feels very far away now. The door closes, the candles flicker. It begins. You wake to silence, stiff and sore. The sheets twisted beneath your legs and a dull ache in your hips that makes you shift cautiously. The candle has burned down to a nub. The door is still closed, and he's asleep beside you, snoring gently, one arm flung across the blankets but not touching you. For a moment, you're not even sure what just happened. Everything is blurry and thick, like a memory you're trying not to remember too clearly. It didn't feel like anything you imagined. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't gentle. It certainly wasn't something you'd ever call sacred. It was over quickly, without much warning or explanation, and now your body's expected to carry the evidence. Blood, if you're lucky. If you didn't bleed, you'd better hope he lies for you. Or that someone does, because people will ask. In some households they already are. Right now your mother-in-law is likely preparing to collect the bedclothes, or a servant girl might be lingering just outside the door, waiting for the cloth that will confirm your virginity and your obedience. If the wedding night was considered the sealing of the deal, the bloody sheet was the receipt. And in some places, that proof was paraded around like a trophy. Yes, literally paraded. Your historical fact for tonight. In parts of 15th century Italy and France, especially among nobility, the wedding bed linens were brought out and displayed, sometimes in the village square, sometimes just before the wedding feast resumed. If they were stained, there was celebration. If they were clean, well, let's just say the second course of dinner got very tense, very quickly. Of course, bleeding didn't always happen. Even the church acknowledged that. But that didn't stop people from expecting it. A girl could be perfectly innocent and still find herself under suspicion just because her body didn't play along with the myth. And while noble women might be able to argue their case, or have a priest speak on their behalf, peasant girls didn't have that luxury. If something seemed off, gossip would bloom like mould and your reputation could rot overnight. Some families, knowing the stakes, got creative. A prick to the fingertip, a drop of pig's blood on the cloth. Tricks passed down through women who understood that survival often meant playing along with other people's lies. It wasn't about deception, it was about protection. You lie there now, listening to the faint creak of footsteps outside the chamber. You know someone will knock soon. You know they'll ask how it went without asking. Maybe someone will bring you broth or wine. Maybe they'll smile at you like you've joined a secret club, but you don't feel like a member. You feel like a pawn that was just moved one square further across the board. He stirs beside you. You turn away, pretending to sleep. You can still feel the weight of him. The way he didn't meet your eyes. The way he didn't ask if you were scared. Maybe he thought he was being kind. Maybe he was nervous too. But none of that changes the reality of what just happened. It wasn't a choice. It was a ritual. A rite you didn't ask for. And here's the part that really messes with your head. People will tell you this is the beginning of your real life. That girlhood was just preparation. That this is what it means to be a woman. Married, claimed, broken in like a new pair of boots. They'll tell you to be grateful. They'll tell you to smile. No one will ask how you feel. Somewhere in the back of your mind, you remember something your aunt whispered once after too much cider. You get used to it. You didn't know what she meant then. You do now. And the truth is, many girls did. They got used to it. They adapted. They found slivers of peace where they could. Gardens, prayers, quiet evenings by the fire when their husbands were drunk and passed out. A few even found love. Eventually. Slowly. But it never started with respect. It started with obligation. And here's your fringe fact of the night. In some monastic writings, medieval theologians debated whether the wedding night should even involve intercourse at all. Some argued that a couple could remain virgins and still be spiritually married. Others believed sex was necessary to complete the sacrament. But the loudest voices almost always favoured consummation, preferably fast, preferably soon, and preferably without complaint from the bride. Of course, the men writing those treatises weren't the ones in the bed. You sit up slowly, pulling the blanket with you, feeling the stiffness in your thighs and the raw scrape of unfamiliar friction. There's a dull pounding behind your eyes. Not quite tears, just the weight of everything. The door creaks open. A woman, maybe your new sister-in-law, enters with a basin and a knowing glance. She doesn't speak. She sets it down, nods once, and leaves. You get up and wash quietly, dipping the cloth into lukewarm water, dabbing at yourself like a wound that won't stop whispering. He doesn't wake. You change into a fresh shift. Your wedding dress is draped over a chair, its bodice wrinkled and slightly damp. Someone will clean it later. Someone always does. And you wonder, how many girls have stood right here staring at the rumpled bed, asking themselves the same thing? Is this it? Is this what they meant? Because it doesn't feel like the start of anything. It feels like an ending. You're still sore the next day, and the next. No one comments on it, though you catch the glances. Quick, assessing looks from older women as you shift in your chair, or walk a little too carefully across the floorboards. They know. They've been through it too. The tight smiles they give you now feel like a code. You survived. Welcome to the club. It's not quite comforting. You're officially a wife now, which means your world has narrowed, not expanded. You thought maybe there would be more after the wedding. some spark of joy, a little freedom, a chance to explore life with your new title. But mostly, it feels like your girlhood has been boxed up and buried somewhere, replaced by a strict schedule of household chores, marital duties, and learning to say yes without flinching. And that's where the church enters the bedchamber. Again. You thought the priest's role ended at the altar, right? Wrong. The church was deeply invested in your marriage, and not just spiritually. There were rules, actual guidelines, about how you were supposed to have sex, how often and even when it was considered holy versus sinful. Spoiler, it's a very weird list. Here's your historical fact for tonight. The penitentials, those handy little church handbooks on sin, listed very specific restrictions about sex. No sex on Sundays, for example, or during Lent, or Advent, or before receiving communion. No sex during menstruation, pregnancy, or while nursing. Oh, and no unnatural positions either. Anything other than missionary was heavily frowned upon, if not outright condemned. So yes, medieval sex came with a rulebook, and it was thicker than your husband's best cloak. You might get a priest who mentions these things casually, maybe during confession or even a house blessing. Or you might be given marital guidance by someone older, a relative, a village elder, even the midwife, passing down church-approved tips about how to keep your husband satisfied without risking damnation. Some of it sounds like superstition. Some of it sounds like control. If you ask too many questions, you're seen as impertinent. If you say nothing, everyone assumes you're doing fine, so you learn to smile, to nod, to pretend. You take in the instructions like they're recipes. Keep him satisfied, avoid temptation, don't enjoy it too much. Be available, but not enthusiastic, and whatever you do, never initiate. Yes, female desire was seen as suspicious, dangerous even. The church often described it as a moral weakness, a force that could tempt men into sin or even derail their spiritual path. The idea of a woman wanting sex, especially outside the goal of producing children, was treated as unnatural. You were supposed to endure it, not crave it. And if you found yourself enjoying it, well, best keep that to yourself, or risk becoming the subject of murmured gossip and midnight prayers. Of course, not all priests were harsh about it. Some genuinely believed that marital intimacy could be a form of mutual support, as long as it stayed within the boundaries. There were even rare sermons that encouraged kindness and patience between spouses, but the dominant message was clear. Sex was a duty, a tool for procreation, not a source of personal fulfillment, and especially not for you. And here's where things get awkward, because some clergy took their role as guides a little too seriously. There are records, disturbing ones, of priests being consulted on bedroom matters and offering advice that went far beyond spiritual counsel. Some women were encouraged to describe their sexual experiences in detail during confession, and while some of these moments were likely sincere attempts at spiritual guidance, others were not. Which brings us to the fringe fact of the night. There are surviving medieval letters and even confession manuals that show priests advising young brides on how to submit joyfully to their husbands, even if the act was painful or frightening. In some cases, priests were known to bless the marriage bed itself, standing awkwardly near the couple before their first night together, praying over the sheets and sprinkling holy water, as if divine protection could make what was about to happen any easier. You wonder if he felt any of this weight. Your husband, that is. He's older than you, but not ancient. In his 30s, maybe. He works long days, talks little. He doesn't hit you, he doesn't shout, but he also doesn't ask what you want. It's not something that seems to occur to him. When he comes to you at night, it's with the same rhythm he approaches everything else. A task to be completed, a routine to maintain. You close your eyes, you try not to wince. You hear women whisper sometimes, in the market, near the well, stories of girls whose husbands were cruel, or relentless, or just oblivious. A few speak of kindness, of rare matches where affection grew like moss in the cracks. But most of them just shrug and say, that's the way it is. They don't talk about what it could be, only what it must be endured as. There's a scholarly debate about whether medieval women had the right to refuse sex within marriage. Canon law acknowledged something called the marital debt, the idea that both husband and wife owed each other access to their bodies. Technically, this went both ways. A woman could theoretically take her husband to court for neglecting his duty, but in practice this was rarely enforced. The power dynamic tilted hard toward him, and if you said no too often, you risked being labelled disobedient, or worse, unfaithful, which is the real kicker. You're expected to be sexually available but emotionally invisible. You're not supposed to enjoy it, but you're also not allowed to refuse it. You're supposed to bear children, but not complain about the process. You're supposed to embody virtue while your husband embodies authority. So you live in this strange limbo. Your body, once a symbol of your family's honour, is now a tool in someone else's household. You manage the home, you tend the fire, you keep the linens clean, and when he wants you, you're expected to be ready. But sometimes, in the quiet moments before sleep, you wonder what it would be like if someone asked you how you felt, if someone lit a candle not to pray over your bed but to see your face more clearly, if pleasure wasn't treated like a sin. You don't have the answers, only questions. And those too you've learned to keep to yourself. And by now you've figured out the quiet truth no one says out loud. Your yes doesn't actually matter. Not in the way modern people would understand it anyway. Consent as a concept hasn't been invented yet. Not for girls like you. What exists instead is obligation, duty, expectation. And once you're married, your body is no longer something you grant access to. It's something that's assumed. If your husband comes to you at night, it isn't framed as a question. It's framed as a right. The church calls it the marital debt, a tidy phrase that makes intimacy sound like bookkeeping. You owe him your body. He owes you his. On paper, it's symmetrical. In real life, it's anything but. He's stronger, older, legally dominant, and backed by custom, law, and God. You're expected to comply, and to do so quietly. This doesn't mean violence is constant or universal. Some men are gentle, some are indifferent, some are rough. But what they all share is permission. Permission you never explicitly gave, but that society assumes you signed over with your vows. Once married, refusal is not interpreted as self-protection. It's interpreted as disobedience. And disobedience for a medieval wife is dangerous. Here's a historical fact that tends to shock people. Under medieval canon law, a wife could not legally accuse her husband of rape. The very idea was considered a contradiction. Marriage itself was understood as perpetual consent. The moment you said "I do," or nodded, or were pressured into silence, that consent became permanent. What happened afterward, no matter how painful or unwanted, was considered lawful. If you protested too loudly, the consequences weren't subtle. You could be beaten, not always by him, but by social pressure. Priests might scold you for denying your husband and tempting him towards sin. Neighbours might whisper that you were cold, unnatural, or rebellious. In extreme cases, women who consistently refused sex could be accused of witchcraft or demonic influence. Because clearly, no normal woman would say no, and yes, there were exceptions, tiny ones. Some church scholars argued that sex should be mutual, that forcing a wife could be sinful. A few even suggested that affection mattered. But those ideas rarely made it out of dusty manuscripts and into daily life. Law followed power, and power did not live in your body. There's a fringe detail worth sitting with here. Medieval medical theory often claimed that women needed sex to stay healthy. Doctors believed that unfulfilled desire caused hysteria, wandering wombs, and madness. So refusal wasn't just disobedience, it was irrational, dangerous. Proof that you didn't know what was good for you, which conveniently justified ignoring your protests. Pregnancy, of course, complicates everything. Once you're expecting, sex doesn't necessarily stop. Some men are cautious, others are not. The church technically forbade sex late in pregnancy, but enforcement was inconsistent. If you miscarried, people might whisper that it was God's will, or your fault. If you carried to term, your body was praised for its productivity, even if you were barely old enough to understand what motherhood meant. And childbirth, that's a whole other threshold. Painful, risky, often deadly. But here's the cruel twist. Surviving childbirth didn't earn you bodily autonomy. It often did the opposite. Once you proved you could bear children, expectations increased. More pregnancies, less rest, less say. You might try to resist in small ways, turning your face away, going still, pretending to sleep, claiming exhaustion. These are not rebellions. They're coping mechanisms, ways to endure without escalating conflict, and many women mastered them. Silence became a language. Stillness became armour. Among women, this reality was understood, even if it wasn't openly discussed. Older wives didn't warn you because warning wouldn't help. Instead, they taught you how to survive, how to keep the peace, how to make yourself small enough to pass through nights without drawing too much attention. It wasn't kindness, it was pragmatism. And yet, despite all of this, the church continued to preach about harmony in marriage, about unity, about love. The contradiction is dizzying. You're told your marriage is sacred, but your discomfort is irrelevant. You're told your body is holy, but your boundaries don't exist. You're told to submit joyfully, as if joy can be commanded. There's a scholarly debate here that historians still wrestle with. Did medieval women understand their experiences as violation, or did the absence of a consent framework mean they interpreted things differently? Some argue that without the language of rape within marriage, women didn't conceptualize it as such. Others counter that pain, fear, and resistance don't require vocabulary to be felt. Just because society lacked the words doesn't mean women lacked the awareness. Letters, poems, and court petitions suggest that many women did know when something was wrong. They just didn't have a system that believed them. Occasionally, a woman pushed back hard enough to leave a mark on the records. There are rare cases of wives appealing to church courts for separation on the grounds of extreme cruelty, bruises, broken bones, public humiliation. In those cases, consent becomes irrelevant because survival is at stake. Even then, the courts often urged reconciliation. Endurance was still the preferred outcome. You learn slowly that your safest path is invisibility. Don't provoke. Don't refuse too sharply. Don't cry too loudly. The world rewards wives who disappear into their roles, and you're very good at disappearing. But something inside you doesn't fully go quiet. It can't. There are moments, rare, fleeting, when you feel anger spark, or grief, or a hollow ache that isn't physical at all. You don't name it. Naming things gives them weight, but you carry it anyway, tucked behind your ribs like a secret you're afraid to examine. At night, when the house settles and the fire burns low, you sometimes think about what your life might have been if choice had been part of the equation, if your body had remained yours, if intimacy had been something you stepped into, not something that stepped over you. The thought is dangerous, so you push it away. Because here's the truth medieval girls lived with. Saying no wasn't an option, but thinking no still was, and even that could feel like a risk. So you learn to survive inside the rules you didn't write. You endure, you adapt, you keep going. And the world calls that obedience. There's no pause between becoming a wife and being expected to become a mother. The moment your marriage is consummated, your body's on a timer. No one says it outright, but the eyes on your stomach start watching. Older women glance at your waistline when they pass you in the market. Midwives suddenly speak to you with knowing tones, and your mother-in-law starts making comments about blessings, each one a little louder than the last. You're 15, maybe 16 if you're lucky, still growing yourself, still trying to understand how your own body works, and now it's expected to make more bodies. There's no instruction manual. No one explains how pregnancy really happens. You only know that if you miss your monthly bleeding, something has begun. And once that happens, you've crossed another threshold, this one even harder to come back from. When you do become pregnant, and you will soon, it's a mix of pride, fear, and fatigue. People congratulate you, as if this was some great accomplishment, but your own feelings are blurred and distant. You're not ready. How could you be? But that's not something anyone asks. Pregnancy is treated like a natural progression, as if the body knows what to do even if the mind is still stuck in childhood. The first few months are strange. You feel off, nauseous, tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix. You still do your chores, kneading dough, sweeping floors, tending animals, but your limbs feel heavier. Your head swims. You're not allowed to say it's hard, though. That would be ungrateful. You're praised now, a woman doing her duty, a vessel filling up with the future. Here's your historical fact for the night. The medieval world believed that pregnancy was a sign of spiritual and moral health. A fruitful wife was a good wife. Infertility, on the other hand, was almost always blamed on the woman, regardless of evidence. If a couple didn't conceive, it was assumed the wife's womb was cold, her body uncooperative. There were tonics and prayers and rituals meant to open her to life, some gentle, others downright disturbing. One such ritual involved a priest blessing the woman's abdomen with holy water while she lay face up in the nave of the church. In some towns, women seeking fertility might be encouraged to touch relics of saints, particularly female ones, as if a scrap of old cloth could unlock the womb. And if none of that worked, well, maybe God was punishing her for some hidden sin. But you don't have that problem. Your belly starts to round before your 16th winter. It grows slowly at first, then faster, until your shift doesn't fit and your back aches from the weight. People stop treating you like a child and start treating you like a symbol. You're the proof that your marriage is valid, that your husband is virile, that your household is fulfilling its godly purpose. Of course, no one tells you what birth will be like. You hear whispers, stories passed between older women, some comforting, most terrifying. A girl your age, Anna, died last year during labour. The baby was too big. The midwife came too late. No one talks about her openly, but you remember her face, the way her laugh used to carry across the fields. Now she's just a cautionary tale told in hushed tones to scare young wives into obedience. You don't know what to expect. Your mother tries to prepare you, but even she struggles to describe it. It hurts, she says, but you'll get through it. That's the best she can offer. Pain is assumed. Fear is normal. Survival is not guaranteed. And here's the fringe fact that makes this all even more bizarre. Some medieval physicians believed that a pregnant woman's thoughts and emotions could physically shape the baby. If you had impure thoughts, your child might be born deformed. If you feared too much, you could cause a miscarriage. Women were told to think holy thoughts, avoid looking at animals, and stay away from anything frightening or sinful, because naturally the baby might absorb it. So now, on top of everything else, you're policing your mind. You're exhausted, aching and queasy, but if you imagine the wrong thing, even in a dream, you're told it could mark your child forever. It's hard to overstate how terrifying that is. You don't even control your own thoughts anymore. As the months stretch on, you start to feel movement, soft at first, like a fluttering bird, then stronger. It's strange, feeling someone else living inside you. You wonder what they'll be like, whether they'll survive, whether you will. You've seen death too many times to assume either is guaranteed. And yet, everyone around you is excited. They speak as if this is the most blessed time of your life. They knit tiny clothes, prepare herbs for the birthing room, and debate names. You sit quietly, trying to ignore the pain in your lower back, the pressure in your ribs, the anxiety pressing on your chest like a weight. You want to ask someone, what if I'm not ready? But you already know the answer. Readiness isn't a requirement. Functionality is. There's an ongoing scholarly debate about how common young motherhood was across different regions and social classes. Some historians argue that while noble girls were often married and pregnant young, peasant women sometimes delayed marriage until their early 20s, especially if they worked or contributed to the family income. Others claim that early motherhood was widespread, driven by mortality rates and the need to produce multiple children to ensure survival. The truth is probably both. Context mattered, but pressure existed everywhere. And so you carry on, counting the days by the tightening of your clothes and the way the baby shifts under your ribs. Nights become harder, sleep comes in bursts. Your husband barely notices, he's already done his part. This is your work now. And as your due date approaches, the fear sharpens. You've seen too many women disappear into childbirth and never come back, but no one allows you to speak the fear aloud. It would be ungrateful. It would be faithless. So you say nothing. You simply wait, full of life and dread, hoping your body doesn't betray you. Because now you're not just surviving for yourself. You're surviving for someone else too. It doesn't matter how many stories you've heard. Nothing prepares you for the moment labour begins. It comes in waves, subtle at first, like cramps you've known before, except this time they don't pass. They build, they linger, they wrap themselves around your spine and squeeze until your knees buckle, and you have to lean against the table, breath caught between your teeth like a prayer you forgot how to finish. The house moves around you like a machine. Word spreads quickly. The midwife arrives with her satchel of herbs and blunt instructions. Other women follow, your mother, aunts, a neighbour who's seen more births than she cares to count. They usher you to the bed, strip your clothes, and begin the ritual that has played out 1,000 times in 1,000 places. The gathering of women for the making of a child. Men are not allowed. Your husband isn't here. Maybe he's outside pretending to work or pacing by the barn or in the tavern, waiting for the sound of a crying baby or a funeral bell. You're surrounded by warm hands and strong voices, but you feel very much alone. The pain is no longer manageable. It owns you now. Your body is no longer yours. It's a battlefield. The contractions come hard and fast and your mind leaves the room. Time collapses. There is only pain and breath and the sharp scent of sweat and fear and crushed sage leaves scattered across the floor. Here's your historical fact for tonight. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous moments in a medieval woman's life. In some areas, maternal mortality was as high as 1 in 10 per birth, depending on access to skilled midwives and sheer luck. And remember, women weren't giving birth just once. They were expected to have as many children as possible, especially if their husbands were landowners or aspiring to be. The midwife grips your hand and murmurs instructions. Push, breathe, pray. A priest might be called to wait outside the house, ready to deliver last rites if things turn. You're already whispering Hail Marys between contractions, not because you're devout, but because fear pulls the words out of you like thread from an unravelling hem. When the baby finally comes, it feels like breaking, a tearing, a ripping of something you didn't even know was whole, and then, suddenly, painfully, it's over. The room fills with sound, gasps, soft laughter, the baby's wail. You're drenched, shaking, dizzy with relief and blood loss. They place the child in your arms. A boy, they say, or a girl. It hardly matters in the haze. You're too tired to care. All you know is that something was taken from you and given back in a different shape. And then they begin to assess the aftermath. The tearing, the bleeding, the risk of infection. The midwife brews a poultice, presses herbs into torn skin. You flinch. There's no anaesthesia, no stitches, just pressure, binding cloth and hope. And the blood doesn't stop right away. In some cases, it never really stops. Now here comes the fringe fact. Medieval midwives had a strange mix of practical skill and magical belief. They relied on herbs like mugwort, yarrow and rue to stop bleeding or stimulate contractions. But they also carried charms, tiny bits of parchment inscribed with prayers, sometimes tucked beneath the bed or tied around the woman's wrist. In some areas, midwives whispered incantations or invoked saints as they worked. It wasn't just medicine, it was ritual, half healing and half hoping. When the child is clean and swaddled and crying, the women around you exhale. Your mother weeps, someone kisses your forehead, but you're only half there. Your body is numb in places that once felt everything. Your thighs tremble, your hands are cold. You want to sleep for a year, but you don't get to. There's no rest in motherhood, not in this century, not in this house. Within hours, the baby is latched to your breast. Your nipples crack and bleed. You leak constantly. Sleep becomes a myth. The only thing more relentless than pregnancy is what comes after. And your husband? He returns eventually, stands at the door, nods. Maybe he's pleased. Maybe he's disappointed it wasn't a boy. Maybe he asks if you're well. But you're not. You're stitched together with linen and stubbornness, smiling for the sake of everyone who needs you to be fine. The baby is tiny, wrinkled, perfect in ways you don't have the language for. You don't know if you love them yet. Love isn't instant. It's something that grows slowly between exhaustion and survival, but you hold them like they're the last whole thing in the world. Scholars still debate how medieval women emotionally processed childbirth and motherhood. Some argue that high infant mortality rates made attachment difficult. Why love something that might die? Others believe the opposite, that precisely because death was so close, mothers clung harder, loved fiercer, wept louder. There are lullabies from the 14th century that read like funeral songs, and burial records filled with babies who never lived to see their first winter. You don't know which category you'll fall into yet. You're still healing. Your womb aches. Your legs are swollen. But when the baby quiets, their breath soft against your collarbone, you feel a sliver of peace. A strange, fragile thing that lives somewhere between pain and pride. You made a life. It nearly killed you. But you're still here. For now, you're 2 weeks postpartum and already back on your feet. Not because your body's ready. It isn't. You're still bleeding. Still aching in places that no one sees. Your belly feels loose and hollow. Your joints soft and your chest sore from the endless cycle of feeding. But the house doesn't run itself. There are floors to sweep, bread to bake, a child to feed, a husband to serve. Recovery isn't really a concept yet. You're alive. That's considered enough. And still, quietly, painfully, your duties in the bedroom haven't gone away. The church says 40 days. That's the official period of purification after childbirth. 40 days of abstinence, supposedly to give your body time to heal and to mark your return to a state of ritual cleanliness. It's rooted in Jewish tradition, passed into Christian canon, and supported by priests who stand in the pulpit and talk about Mary's postnatal seclusion, as if it's something your exhausted body should aspire to. But your husband, he's not a priest. He's a man with expectations and a household with needs, and if you think those 40 days are sacred, well, you're not the one holding the power in this arrangement. Sometimes he waits, sometimes he doesn't. Sometimes, even if he does, there's pressure before the blood has stopped, before your stitches have dissolved, before you've even learned your baby's cry by heart. No one talks about the pain of postpartum sex, the way your body flinches, even when you try to steel yourself, the way fear settles in the pit of your stomach and makes your skin go tight. You say nothing, of course, or maybe you do, and he shrugs, or mutters something about duty, or reminds you gently, or not, that your role is to satisfy, to keep him from temptation, to keep peace in the house. You close your eyes and go still as you've learned to do. You've practiced being absent while still physically present. It's a skill now, like kneading dough or folding linens. It's survival, wrapped in silence. And here's your historical fact for tonight. Medieval church doctrine taught that marital sex was permissible, but always slightly suspect. Even within marriage, pleasure was a slippery slope. It was allowed, but only if it remained subordinate to procreation. If you enjoyed it too much, or if you initiated it, or if your husband sought it with unusual frequency, that could be interpreted as lust. And lust, even in a marriage bed, could stain your soul. It was a double bind. You were expected to be available, but not eager. Faithful, but not frigid. Modest, but not cold. And no one explained how to find that balance, because the very idea that you might have your own sexual feelings was mostly erased from the equation. Of course, that didn't stop women from feeling. Desire doesn't evaporate just because it's forbidden. You hear whispers sometimes, other wives talking by the well, or older women laughing behind their hands, about moments of pleasure, of want, of aching for something beyond obligation. But these moments are never discussed openly. They live in corners, in shadow, in poetry that no man ever reads. There's a fringe fact that survives in the margins of medieval manuscripts. Some church confessors were trained to ask married women whether they ever felt too much enjoyment during sex. If they said yes, they were advised to pray for forgiveness, as if joy itself had somehow violated divine law. Some priests even prescribe penance for it: fasting, additional prayers, silence. So even your own body betrays you. If you don't feel pleasure, you're a cold wife. If you do, you're sinful. Either way, the target never moves. You're always wrong. And yet, inside all of this, you begin to notice something strange. Your mind is waking up. Maybe it's the isolation. Maybe it's the late nights nursing your baby while everyone sleeps. Maybe it's the way your body has been used, over and over, without pause. But you start to think more than you speak. You question things in the privacy of your skull. You remember how it felt to run through the fields when you were 10, hair loose, skirts muddy, lungs full of laughter. That girl still lives inside you. She's quiet now, but not gone. Some women channel this restlessness into piety. They pray more, fast more, wear their chastity like armour. Others go inward, writing letters if they can write, or whispering secrets to each other under the guise of shared chores. A few grow bold, seeking out herbal knowledge, reading forbidden texts, exploring the world of apothecaries and midwives where power flickers like a candle in the dark. But you survive. You feed the baby, you tend the fire, you lie back when asked, and you keep that tiny seed of rebellion buried deep. You think about pleasure sometimes, about what it would mean to want something, rather than simply endure it. You wonder if any woman ever has. And here's the scholarly debate still swirling centuries later. Did medieval women find ways to experience sexual agency within these systems? Or were they so tightly bound by culture and religion that even their desire became shaped by duty? Some researchers argue that courtly love traditions gave women space to imagine romantic and erotic fulfillment, albeit mostly through literature. Others believe those fantasies were a male invention, with no real grounding in women's lived experiences. Either way, you're not living in a ballad. You're living in a house with a crying baby, an indifferent husband, and a body that still hasn't healed. But somewhere, Between the pain and the routine, a part of you still dreams. You can't say it out loud. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But you think it, late at night, when the world is quiet, and you're awake with milk stains on your shift and a phantom ache between your hips. You think, there has to be more than this, and that thought, however small, refuses to die. You're barely 16 and already part of a hidden world, one woven together in whispers, glances, and bundles of herbs wrapped tight in cloth. The women around you, neighbours, midwives, sometimes even nuns, don't talk openly about what they know, but they know things. They know what flowers to steep to ease a cramp, what seeds to chew to delay a missed bleeding, what roots, ground to powder and taken with warm wine, might stop something already started. You never see these things in daylight. They're handed off behind closed doors, tucked into aprons, passed beneath tables during shared chores. Sometimes they come with no words at all, just a look, a nod, a pressed hand. It's a network older than most laws, and it's the only reason some girls like you make it through with their minds and bodies intact. Because here's the truth. Childbirth is terrifying, constant, and sometimes deadly. And most women, quietly, desperately, don't want to go through it more than they have to. But the men who make the rules, they want sons. And the church, it wants you fruitful. And society is not exactly rooting for your autonomy. So women have found workarounds. Your historical fact for the night is this. Medieval women did, in fact, have access to birth control, and even rudimentary abortion. It wasn't sanctioned, of course. It wasn't safe by modern standards either, but it existed. Recipes show up in medical texts and herbals written by monks and physicians alike, though always with a warning that they should never be used by good women. Pennyroyal, savin, rue, wild carrot, all plants known even today for their effects on the womb. They were whispered about in kitchens, tucked into journals, muttered during long walks in the woods. And those women who dared to use them, they were playing a dangerous game. Because if anyone found out, especially a priest, you weren't just breaking the law. You were defying the will of God. Abortion, even in its earliest form, was painted as a crime against nature. The church's stance evolved over the centuries, but by the late Middle Ages it was firmly in the mortal sin category. Even the suggestion of preventing pregnancy could mark a woman as sinful, suspicious, maybe even a witch. Which is the fringe fact for tonight. In some inquisitorial records from the 14th and 15th centuries, women accused of witchcraft were also accused of using herbs to close the womb. The logic was twisted. If you weren't constantly pregnant, something unnatural had to be at work. If you didn't want more children, it couldn't be wisdom or fear. It had to be dark magic. So, what did women do? They got clever. They shared recipes disguised as teas for headaches, or fatigue. They asked the midwife to bring certain bundles, and never wrote down what was in them. They watched the moon, counted the days, learned their cycles by instinct. And when they needed help, they went to each other. Not the church, not the men, but each other. You learn by doing. You ask your mother about certain herbs and she scolds you. Not harshly, but just enough to remind you of the risk. Then later, she slips a little pouch into your hand and tells you not to tell anyone where it came from. You never do. The pouch smells bitter, something sharp and earthy. You keep it in a crack behind the hearth, hidden from sight, wrapped in wool. You don't know if you'll ever use it, but just knowing it's there makes your chest feel a little lighter, because the fear doesn't leave after the first child. If anything, it grows. You've seen women waste away from back-to-back pregnancies. You've seen them deliver stillborns in silence, blood soaking through mattresses while everyone pretends not to notice. You've seen the ones who scream during labour and are labelled possessed, and the ones who say nothing at all and never wake up. And still, they keep trying. Because what else is there? No one asks if you want more children. The assumption is that you will, until your body breaks or your womb finally gives up. You might give birth to 8 children, and only 2 survive. You might give birth to 3, and all of them do. There's no telling. But the one certainty is that the process never gets easier. So the women around you become your lifeline, not your husband, not the priest, not the scribe who writes poems about the purity of maidens. No, your lifeline is the neighbour who tells you how to brew tansy tea when your monthly bleeding won't come. The midwife who gently asks if you're ready for another baby, and then slips you a pinch of something that might give you a few more months to breathe. The widow who was never able to have children and is now the most knowledgeable herbalist in the village because she had the time to learn. There's a kind of underground power in this, a quiet rebellion, a network of women keeping each other alive, not always openly, not always safely, but with a fierce kind of loyalty that no man understands. There's scholarly debate, of course. Some insist these methods were rare, unreliable, even dangerous, and yes, many were. But others argue that women were far more competent than history gives them credit for. They knew their bodies, they tracked their cycles, they tested and recorded and passed down knowledge for generations. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And you? You sit at the hearth, your child asleep in a basket nearby, stirring a pot of something warm and bitter, not strong enough to stop a pregnancy, just strong enough to calm your nerves, to slow your racing thoughts, to remind yourself that not everything about your life is out of your hands. Because even here, in this world of rigid roles and constant expectations, you're not completely powerless, not as long as other women are whispering. You've never been inside a convent before, not until your cousin Isolde joined the Sisters of St. Agnes, and your mother insisted you accompany her on one of the feast days. You were just a child then, barely old enough to braid your hair without help, but the moment you stepped through those stone archways and into the cool silence, something in you shifted. The air felt different, quieter, yes, but also heavier, like the walls were keeping secrets, and none of them were in a hurry to leave. Now, years later, you think about Isolde more than you'd admit. She was 16 when she took the veil. Not because she was pious, not really. Her family couldn't afford a dowry for marriage, but they could afford a smaller one to place her in a convent. An acceptable fate for a girl who didn't have beauty or social leverage. She told you once, in a moment of startling honesty, that she chose the habit because it meant she wouldn't have to lie beneath a man she didn't love. You didn't understand what she meant then. Now you do. The convent, despite its walls and vows and endless prayers, offered a kind of freedom. No husbands, no childbirth, no marital debts. You traded those for discipline, fasting, and hours of kneeling. But some girls preferred that, chose it even. And over time, a different kind of life bloomed inside those cloisters. It wasn't always chaste. Here's your historical fact of the night. Despite their reputation for holiness, medieval convents were not always paragons of sexual purity. There are records, letters, visitation reports, court documents that speak of illicit affairs, secret liaisons, and even entire communities of nuns reprimanded for immodest behaviour. Some were caught with priests, others with local men, and yes, some with each other. Of course, no one in your village says these things openly. Nuns are holy women, brides of Christ, beyond suspicion. But the whispers exist. The travelling merchant who claims he delivered letters between a nun and a knight. The friar who tells your uncle about goings-on in the convent downriver. Even your mother once muttered that not all sisters were as devoted as they pretended to be. There's a fringe detail buried in an old court record from 14th century Germany. 2 nuns were excommunicated after being found in carnal embrace. The wording is vague, deliberately so, but the accusation is clear. They had loved each other and been caught. The church didn't know what to do with them. There were no clear rules for women loving women, so it treated them like sinners, punished them, erased them from the convent's history. But they existed, and they weren't alone. There's something almost inevitable about it, really. Put dozens of women together, remove them from male oversight, give them time and privacy and shared suffering, and intimacy will form. Sometimes friendship, sometimes sisterhood, sometimes love. Maybe you felt it yourself, an accidental touch while washing clothes that lingers too long, a look exchanged over candlelight in the chapel, a conversation at midnight that makes your chest feel tight, not with fear, but with something else, something you're not supposed to name. Because even in convents, desire didn't die, it just changed shape. There's a scholarly debate still unfolding about the nature of same-sex relationships in medieval convents. Some argue these were simply close friendships, misinterpreted by modern eyes. Others point to poetry, confessions, and disciplinary actions as evidence that real romantic and erotic connections happened. The truth, likely, is somewhere in between. Some women loved each other deeply, physically. Others simply sought comfort in the only place it was allowed to exist, within one another's arms. Isolde once wrote you a letter, short, formal, full of scripture, but there was a line near the end that still burns in your memory. Within these walls, we are watched by God, but seen only by each other. At the time, it struck you as poetic. Now it feels like a confession. You sometimes wonder if she found happiness there, behind the veil, whether she truly felt closer to God, or whether it was just a different kind of survival. Because that's what most paths are for girls like you, strategies, dodging one fate by choosing another. Whether it's the marriage bed or the prayer cell, your choices always feel like trade-offs. Freedom with strings, safety with silence. Still, some convents were vibrant, even rebellious. Women wrote texts, composed music, tended gardens, taught other girls to read. Hildegard of Bingen, remember that name, was a 12th century abbess who wrote about visions, medicine, and the female body with a boldness that would make most priests squirm. She wasn't alone, there were others. Women who carved out tiny empires of knowledge within the confines of religious duty. You wonder what might have happened if you had joined Isolde. If you'd traded the cradle and the husband for the cross and the cloister. Would it have been lonely, empowering, both? Because for all the rules and vows, the convent gave women something rare, each other. A world without male ownership, a space where secrets could be kept and desire could sometimes live. Quietly, dangerously, beautifully. You think about that when your husband snores beside you, and your child cries in the night, and your body feels like it was borrowed, broken, and never quite returned. You think about it when you kneel in church and listen to a priest speak about virtue as if it were a thing women owed to men. And sometimes you close your eyes and imagine a stone room with tall windows and other women singing in Latin, while candles flicker like stars, and you wonder, not for the first time, if the holiest love was the one they tried hardest to silence. The songs always sounded sweeter in stories. The ballads drifting through the village from travelling minstrels, knights pledging loyalty to ladies in towers, love blooming in secret gardens, noble women passing favours in silk to brave warriors before battle. It all sounded so noble, so swoon-worthy, so unlike the life you live, and yet, for a brief moment in your younger years, you believed in it. You clutched the words to your chest like a secret promise, that love could be more than duty, that someone might choose you not for your dowry or your womb, but for you. But then you grew up, and you realised that courtly love, those gilded poetic romances, had nothing to do with real girls. Real love in your world doesn't come with harp music. It comes with a man who smells like sweat and earth, who grunts when he climbs into bed, who doesn't ask what you want and wouldn't know what to do with your answer even if he did. You still hear the ballads, sure, sung by boys with smooth voices and dreams they haven't yet outgrown, but they sound different now, hollow, like church bells ringing for a funeral that already happened. And still, the stories continue. Because the idea of courtly love, so far removed from your own reality, wasn't written for women like you. It was crafted by men, for men. Specifically, noblemen with too much time on their hands and not enough wars to fight. Love became a game, a performance, a way to prove refinement, to show off poetic skill, to flirt with the idea of a woman without actually having to live with her crying children or her bleeding body. Here's your historical fact of the night. Courtly love as a literary tradition exploded in the 12th century, especially in France. Troubadours wrote poems of unconsummated longing, often placing noble women on pedestals, untouchable, perfect, more idea than human. The love was deliberately unfulfilled. It was meant to torment, to inspire, to distract, and in many ways it had nothing to do with actual women at all. The twist. Many of the women being worshipped were already married, sometimes to the very lords funding the poet. Adultery was not just tolerated in these stories, it was idealized, but only if it was tragic, beautifully doomed, draped in symbolism. Real adultery for a real woman came with shame, scandal, maybe even execution. But a fictional affair? That was art. It's easy to see the problem, because while men got to dream of perfect women, real women were living very imperfect lives, scrubbing floors, bearing children, enduring marriages. Meanwhile, the same songs that celebrated romantic yearning turned around and punished any woman who actually acted on desire. Wanting love in fiction was noble. Wanting it in real life made you a whore. And here's your fringe fact. Some of the earliest known female poets, like the ℍ𝕚𝕚𝕚 of Occitania, wrote back. They took the language of courtly love and used it to express their own longings, their own frustration. They wrote verses not just as muses but as creators. In one poem, a woman mourns a lover who never chose her. In another, a wife tells her absent husband she's found pleasure elsewhere. These voices didn't survive by accident. They survived because they echoed truths too raw to erase. You think about this sometimes, about the difference between the songs and the silences, between the woman praised in verse and the woman ignored in real life. You wonder what it would be like to be chosen not for usefulness but for presence, to be looked at the way the minstrels describe, like sunlight breaking through branches, like the moon pulling the tide. Ridiculous metaphors, sure, but still, they sound better than "you'll do." And then there's your own secret, that brief moment when you felt something like the stories. Maybe it was a glance from the blacksmith's apprentice, the way his hand brushed yours when passing bread. Maybe it was the peddler with the kind smile who called you bright-eyed and meant it. Maybe it was a woman, your friend, who once tucked your hair behind your ear in a way that made you forget to breathe. Nothing happened, nothing could happen, but for a flicker of time you remembered what it felt like to be seen. But real life has no room for flickers. Real life is obligation, work, repetition. There's little space for poetry between the baby crying and the bread burning. You carry water, you keep the fire going, you press your hands against your thighs to ground yourself when the ache of everything becomes too much. Some women fall into love anyway. Real love. Not the clean stylized version sung in taverns, but the messy kind built on shared hardship. A husband who listens, a wife who holds her partner's hand through the stillbirth, a neighbour who brings soup without asking why you're crying. These loves are quiet, unrecorded, but they matter. And others? They chase the fiction. They take lovers. They meet in stables or under trees. They risk everything for a single hour of feeling chosen. Some are caught, punished, branded, banished. Others are simply broken, by guilt, by fear, by the weight of a love that was never safe to carry. There's a scholarly debate about whether courtly love empowered women by placing them on pedestals, or imprisoned them there. Some argue that it gave women narrative space, at least in literature. Others say it reduced them to symbols, pure, passive, endlessly desirable and always silent. You lean toward the latter, because when you hear the ballads now, you don't imagine yourself in them. You imagine yourself outside the tavern, ears pressed to the door, wondering what it would take for someone to write a song about your life. The blood, the silence, the endurance. There's no lute-strumming poet for that, so you write it in your head instead. A rough melody. No rhyme, no metaphor, just truth. And maybe one day someone will hear it. You used to see them as shadows, wrapped in black, walking slowly behind funeral processions or sitting quietly near the back of the church, veils pulled so low you could barely catch their eyes. Widows. That's what they were. That's all anyone called them. You never thought about what came after that title, what it meant to wake up one day and no longer belong to a man, no longer be tethered by marriage or touched without asking. You didn't see them as powerful. You saw them as ghosts, until you started noticing something strange. The older widows in your village didn't seem especially mournful. Some grieved, yes, but others looked lighter. You're older now. Not old, but not new either. You've lived long enough to have buried a child, long enough to stop expecting tenderness from your husband, long enough to know when someone's pretending to pray and when someone's really pleading with God. So when the widow Annalise begins showing up to church in richer colours and quieter shoes, when she starts laughing again, gently, around her teeth, you notice. Because here's the thing no one tells you when you're a girl. Widowhood can feel like freedom. You don't wish your husband dead. That's not what this is. But you can't deny the quiet envy that stirs when you see a woman no longer being watched. A woman who can own property in her own name. Because yes, that's your historical fact for tonight. Unlike married women, who were legally absorbed into their husbands, widows in many parts of medieval Europe could manage their own estates, sign contracts, and make decisions about their households. They were, in the eyes of the law, complete persons again. Of course, not all widows were treated equally. Poor women might be forced to remarry for protection, or to avoid starvation. Younger widows were often pressured into matches before the body and the ground even cooled. But the ones with land, connections, or grown sons, they had options, real ones. You start to look at them differently. You notice how they move, how they speak more freely, how they no longer shrink when the priest walks by. Some even choose not to remarry at all. Imagine that. A woman alone by choice. No man's hand on her waist. No nightly duties. No risk of another childbirth that might tear her open from the inside. And then there's the fringe fact. Some widows became active players in local politics and business. They ran shops, lent money, managed vineyards. One Englishwoman, Marjorie Arnold, even served as a legal guardian and court witness in her village. That's right. While most wives had no legal voice, widows could speak up, and often did. This doesn't mean life was easy. Widowhood came with its own kind of vulnerability. Accusations of greed, gossip about loose morals, the ever-present threat of being labelled a witch, especially if a woman spoke her mind too freely or lived too comfortably without male oversight. But many widows knew how to walk the line. They played the part of piety in public, while quietly doing whatever they wanted behind their locked doors. You begin to imagine what your life might look like years from now, if your husband dies before you. If your children are grown, if the house is yours, the food is yours, the body is yours again. It feels wrong to fantasize about it, but it also feels honest. And here's where the debate begins. One historian still argue about, did widows in the Middle Ages actually find more freedom, or was that freedom always conditional, always under threat of being taken back? Some scholars believe the legal autonomy was more symbolic than real, that social pressure kept most women in line. Others point to evidence of widows using their status to climb socially, to remarry on their terms or to avoid marriage entirely. The truth, you think, probably depends on the woman. And women, as you know by now, are never just one thing. You sit with Annalise one afternoon, shelling peas in the shade. She hums while she works. Her hair's still half covered, but her sleeves are pushed up, and she smells like rosemary and smoke. She asks about your children. You ask about her garden. And then carefully you ask if she's ever thought of marrying again. She doesn't laugh. She doesn't flinch. She just says, "Why would I give anyone else the right to decide when I speak?" And then she goes back to shelling peas. That night, you lie beside your husband, who isn't cruel, just predictable, and you stare at the ceiling and wonder how many more winters he'll live. You feel guilty for wondering. You also feel something else, a flicker of anticipation, not for his death, for your life. You think about what it would mean to own land, to make decisions, to sleep in your own bed without being touched unless you wanted it, to walk into church not as someone's wife, but as yourself. The thought doesn't leave. It follows you through the weeks, through your chores, through the cold mornings and the warm afternoons and the firelight that dances across your kitchen wall. You don't say it aloud, you just carry it. Because in this world, where girls become wives before they understand what it means, and wives become mothers before their hips have stopped growing, widowhood is the first time many women are allowed to stop, to breathe, to choose. You don't need to wish for it, but you're not afraid of it either. You're hanging laundry when it happens. Just a few words, tossed from the mouth of a passing neighbour like crumbs to the dirt. Barely a sentence, really, but it lands with a weight you feel in your bones. She's always been a bit loose, hasn't she? It's said with a smirk, aimed not at you this time, but at another woman walking by. Sabine, the brewer's daughter, hair uncovered, skirts a bit too short for the local taste. You glance at her and see nothing scandalous, just a woman walking home, but the word loose clings to the air like smoke. You keep folding sheets, but you're listening now. The other woman chuckles, not kindly. It's always the quiet ones you have to watch. You nod politely, you say nothing. But something inside you clenches, because you've heard that word before. Maybe not said to your face, but whispered when you laughed too loud or danced too long, or lingered too close to the blacksmith's son. Loose. It's not about your clothes. It's not about your behaviour, not really. It's about your refusal to shrink. It's about the way women who don't fit the mould are marked, and marked they are. Tonight's historical fact is a brutal one. The concept of the loose woman in medieval Europe wasn't just social slander, it was legal and institutional. Women accused of being sexually immoral could face real consequences. Public shaming, banishment, confinement in a house of correction, even accusations of witchcraft. And the evidence required? Often just a rumour, a neighbour's suspicion, a priest's disapproval. There were no trials for being a good girl, but there were plenty for being seen as a bad one. Sabine isn't the first. You remember Isabeau, the weaver's niece who disappeared after a man claimed she tempted him. The story shifted 3 times before it vanished altogether, but no one saw her again. And Alice, the widow who dared to take a younger lover, now pretends to be deaf when she walks past the church, just to avoid hearing what the matrons mutter under their breath. The punishment wasn't always formal. Often it came in the form of isolation, cold shoulders, jobs lost, invitations that stopped arriving, a slow erasure. And sometimes it was worse. Hair shorn, faces branded, paraded through town with signs of shame pinned to their backs. You don't have to look far for examples. They're etched into the memory of every girl in the village. Here's the fringe fact. In some towns, local officials kept actual lists of women labelled as suspect. These weren't criminals, not thieves or murderers, just women who had been seen too many times in the wrong place with the wrong man. Sometimes nothing happened. Other times, being on that list meant being first to be questioned if something scandalous occurred. A stillborn child, a fight between men, a sudden sickness. And often these loose women were the ones who helped others survive. They knew how to end a pregnancy. They knew how to satisfy desire without conception. They knew what to say to a girl too scared to go home. But the same knowledge that made them valuable also made them vulnerable. Power, in the wrong hands, or in a woman's hands, always looked suspicious. There's a scholar whose work you once overheard a visiting priest discussing. He argued that medieval society invented the loose woman as a kind of moral scarecrow, a symbol to keep all the other women in line. Don't be too friendly or you'll be like her. Don't be too curious or you'll end up like her. Don't be noticed unless you want to be named. And it worked. Mostly. You think of all the things you've silenced inside yourself because of that fear. The compliments you brushed off. The touches you didn't return. The laughter you swallowed. You've learned to walk like you're apologising. To speak like every word might tip the balance. Not because you are loose, but because you can't afford to be seen that way. You start to realise something chilling. The label doesn't protect virtue. It controls behaviour. And who gets labelled? Not the men, usually. A man can flirt, brag, even father a child out of wedlock and still be welcome at the tavern. But a woman who laughs at the wrong joke can be watched for the rest of her life. Your virginity is precious until it's not. Then it's proof of your shame. Sabine keeps walking, she doesn't look back, and you watch her go, wondering what stories they've told about you when your back was turned. Maybe that one time you stayed out past sunset. Maybe that night you danced during a festival without checking who was watching. Maybe when your second child was born just a little too close to your wedding anniversary. You know how quickly suspicion can be sown from nothing. And still, a small part of you envies her. Not for being called loose, but for not caring. For walking with her chin up despite the words. For wearing her hair down like a challenge. There's something brave in that. There's a debate among historians about how much internal power women wielded against these accusations. Did they defend each other, band together, form social circles of protection, or did they turn on one another to preserve their own reputations? The answer, as always, is complicated. Some women offered sanctuary, others sharpened their tongues like knives. But one thing is certain, the threat of being labelled loose kept generations of girls in line. You finish hanging the laundry, the sheets flutter in the breeze like pale flags. You glance at the sky, grey with coming rain, and wonder what it might feel like to walk without shame. To live without the fear of being named something you never agreed to be. Loose. Such a small word. But in your world it can unravel everything. You don't talk about them in front of the priest. You don't say their names too loudly, even though everyone knows who they are. You see them at the edges of the market square, leaning against doorways, heads tilted just so. You see them cleaning out the basin behind the bathhouse, hands red from scrubbing, hair tied back with ribbons that are a little too bright for morning. You know who they are. You know what they do. You were told to stay away from them. And yet, you watch. Because the women who sell sex in your town, openly or thinly veiled under entertaining, carry themselves differently. They're not rich, not safe, not protected, but they are untethered. Not owned by a husband, not defined by a father, not pretending they have no body. They're dangerous, but not because they're evil, because they live outside the script. Your mother warned you once, eyes sharp, only desperate women take that path. But sometimes desperation is the only honest thing in a world of bad choices. You've seen women forced to marry at 12. You've seen others die in childbirth. You've seen a girl get sent away after being raped, her only sin being her inability to hide it. And yet those stories are treated like unfortunate accidents. while the sex worker is the one they all look down on. So, let's talk about her. Because she existed. Not just in alleyways or bawdy songs, but in records, court scrolls, even tax lists. Tonight's historical fact: prostitution was legal in many medieval towns, and even regulated by local authorities. In places like London, Paris and Avignon, brothels operated under licenses. They paid fees to the crown, they were inspected, and their workers. They were often treated like a necessary evil, tolerated to protect honest women from male desire. Let that sink in. Sex work existed so that you wouldn't be touched without permission, or so they said. This arrangement was rooted in the belief that male lust was inevitable, unstoppable. So society provided an outlet, usually in the form of a woman no one was expected to respect. She absorbed it all. She became the sponge for male appetite. She was the scapegoat and the relief valve. She was a service, not a person. In exchange, she got very little. A room, if she was lucky. Some coins. Maybe an older madam who offered protection. But she also got disease, violence, and the ever-present threat of being arrested if she worked outside the designated brothels. In some towns, women were forced to wear yellow veils or striped cloaks to mark them as sex workers, branded by fabric, separated by thread. And yet, despite this, despite everything, they survived. Many of them didn't do it for fun. They did it because they had no dowry, because their husbands died, because their families cast them out, because work for women was scarce, and this was the only labour where their bodies, unwanted by marriage, still held value. Fringe fact of the night. In some parts of medieval Spain and southern France, former sex workers founded all-female communities, safe houses essentially, where they could retire, support each other, and even care for orphaned children. The church often looked the other way, because even they understood that once someone had served their social purpose, they still deserved a roof and a warm meal. You find yourself thinking about that on slow afternoons, when your hands are busy but your mind drifts. What would it be like to live without the constant mask? To say yes because you chose to, not because you owed it? To take the risk of being called impure in exchange for even a moment of freedom? Of course, freedom for sex workers was relative. Most lived in poverty. Many were abused. Some disappeared without a trace. But the thing that rattles you is this. They knew. They knew what sex was. They weren't cloaked in silence. They weren't taught to be ashamed of pleasure. They may have suffered, but they weren't naive. You, on the other hand, had your innocence shaped like a cage. You were told to be good, to be pure, to be patient, but never to be curious, never to be informed, never to take your own desire seriously. So now you know nothing and are expected to know everything. There's a debate among scholars about how much agency medieval sex workers really had. Some argue they were exploited entirely, tools of a patriarchal system, trapped by poverty. Others suggest that within their limited circumstances some women carved out real choices. They negotiated terms, they built networks, some even became quite wealthy. But at what cost? You think of one, a girl named Catherine, not from your village but close. She moved through the market like someone with nothing left to lose. Once she caught you watching her, and she smirked. Not cruelly, but knowingly. She saw the question in your eyes. You never spoke. But you remember how it felt to see someone so fully outside the system and so completely herself. You don't want her life, but you can't help but respect the truth of it. Because if the world has already decided what your body is worth, there's a strange sort of power in naming the price yourself, in turning a trap into a choice, even if the choice is messy, even if it's painful, even if it's judged. You hang your laundry, you stir your pot, you lie beside your husband in the dark, and still, sometimes in the quiet, you think about her, walking home at sunrise, veil off, hair loose, humming to herself like the world can't touch her anymore. And for just a moment you feel something you're not supposed to. Admiration. It begins with a glance, too long, too tender. Not the kind you give a friend, not the kind you can explain away with shared laughter or the bond of motherhood. It lingers. It makes your heart stumble in your chest like a colt on unsteady legs. And the worst part isn't that she looks back, it's that she smiles. You've never thought about women like this before, at least not in a way you allowed yourself to name. There have always been moments, small things, like the way your stomach twisted watching Annalise tie up her hair, or how your skin warmed when Elsa touched your wrist while helping you thread a needle. You told yourself it was admiration, friendship, something pure, and maybe it was. But now you're not so sure. She's a nun. That's what makes it worse, or better. You can't decide. You only see her when you go to the convent to deliver bread or herbs. She's young, maybe your age, with eyes that don't flinch and a voice that wraps around words like honey around a spoon. Her name is Sister Clara. She thanks you when you hand her the bundle, then asks if you'd like to stay for evening prayer. She says it gently, like she's asking if you want to step out of the storm and into candlelight. You say yes. You sit beside her on the stone bench, watching the shadows flicker across the chapel wall. You don't look at her directly. You can't. But your body feels charged, aware of every inch between your elbow and hers. You don't pray, you just breathe, quiet, hopeful, confused. Tonight's historical fact might surprise you. Same-sex relationships between women were not entirely invisible in medieval Europe. They were rarely discussed, and even more rarely punished, but they happened. In convents, especially, close emotional and sometimes erotic bonds formed between women who lived and worked in constant proximity, often without male supervision. Some scholars believe these bonds were platonic. Others see evidence of something deeper, hidden in letters, poems, even trial records. Because yes, there were trials, rare but real. Here's your fringe fact. In 1477, 2 nuns in Speyer, Germany, Katharina ℍ𝕚𝕚𝕚 and her unnamed partner, were tried for unnatural practices. Katharina was executed. Her partner's fate remains unclear. The records are sparse, vague, full of euphemism, but the implication is there. They loved each other, and the world punished them for it. And yet, most of the time, these relationships flew under the radar, because women were expected to be close, to kiss each other on the cheek, to share beds when cold, to whisper secrets. Emotional intimacy between women wasn't just accepted, it was normal. It gave cover to something deeper, something that couldn't be spoken but could still be felt. That's what makes it both safer and more dangerous. You find yourself thinking about Clara when you're doing other things, when you're kneading dough, when you're brushing your daughter's hair, when your husband is moving beside you in bed and you're pretending to be asleep. You imagine her hands, how they'd feel if they touched you differently, not with ownership, with care, with interest. There's a kind of ache to it that you don't have language for. You visit the convent again. You bring honey this time. She takes it with both hands, her fingers brushing yours longer than they need to. You talk about bees, of all things. She tells you that Sister Maria is afraid of them, that she runs every time one flies into the herb garden. You laugh. It's the first real laugh you've let out in... You don't know what you're doing, you don't know what she's doing, but something is happening, and then one day it shifts. She invites you to help her dry herbs in the warm room off the cloister. It's quiet there, full of the smell of lavender and sage. You move slowly, arranging stems, trying not to shake. She says your name like it's a prayer. You finally look at her, really look, and for a moment nothing else exists, but you don't kiss. Of course you don't. You're not that brave. Or maybe she isn't. Maybe both of you understand what you'd be risking, because even if no one speaks of it, you know what would happen if you were caught. You wouldn't be tried as lovers, you'd be tried as heretics, or witches, or simply broken women. No one would believe it was love. They'd say it was possession, corruption, madness. There's scholarly debate over how common these relationships were, how they were understood at the time. Some argue that medieval society lacked the framework to label female same-sex desire. Others say it was recognised and deliberately erased. But one thing is certain. Just because something isn't recorded doesn't mean it didn't happen. You return home with your head full and your hands smelling like rosemary. You don't tell anyone. You don't write it down. But the memory lives inside you like a secret flame. You still see her. You still speak. Nothing happens, but everything happens. And in the quiet corners of your life you begin to understand something terrifying and beautiful. Love does not ask for permission. It simply is. It does not care about law or custom or gender. It does not need a priest's blessing. It grows in silence, in longing, in touches that linger, and words left unsaid. You will never be hers, not in any public way. But for a moment, you were, and it was enough. Not because it lasted, but because it was real. It's market day, and the square is swollen with voices, vendors shouting prices, children weaving through carts, someone's goat bleating in protest from under a cloth-covered stall. You've come for turnips, maybe dried fish, but mostly to escape your house for a while. Sometimes being around people, loud, bustling, distracted people, feels like safety, like camouflage, until the shouting shifts. It begins near the fountain. A ripple of attention turns heads toward the commotion. At first you think it's a scuffle over spoiled meat or a stolen coin purse, but then you see her. A girl, maybe 15, maybe less. Hair falling from her braid, eyes wide like a cornered animal. She's flanked by 2 parish guards, both gripping her arms tightly. Her skirts are torn, and there's a smear of something, mud, blood, on her sleeve. Someone in the crowd spits. Another murmurs, "Filth!" You hear the word fornicator hissed like venom from a woman nearby. You don't know the girl, not really. You've seen her once or twice near the edge of the fields, carrying eggs in her apron. She didn't look dangerous. She looked like you once. They drag her forward. You try not to look, but it's impossible to turn away. They're taking her to the pillory. Tonight's historical fact. Public punishment for sexual crimes was disturbingly common in the medieval world, especially for women. Stocks, pillories, and public whipping posts were used to shame those accused of adultery, fornication, or simply indecency. These weren't always crimes of choice. Often they were punishments for victims, girls who had been coerced, assaulted, or caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Consent wasn't always part of the trial, but appearance, that was damning enough.
The guards reach the wooden frame. The girl isn't struggling anymore. She's gone quiet in that way you've seen before, in livestock being led to slaughter, in women at funerals who've cried themselves dry. Her face is pale, not from shame, but from something deeper. Something like disbelief. She's shoved into the pillory, her wrists and neck clamped into place. Someone throws a cabbage. It hits her shoulder, leaves a green smear on her bodice. She flinches but doesn't cry out. You stay back, near the edge of the square, half hidden behind a cart. Your stomach churns. You know the girl isn't guilty of anything, at least not in a way that should matter. Maybe she met a boy. Maybe she trusted someone. Maybe she was forced and no one believed her. Maybe she was just caught walking home after dark, unaccompanied. That's enough sometimes. There's a fringe fact that never makes it into sermons. Medieval punishments for sexual misconduct were wildly unequal. Men might be fined, made to pay a penance, or, at worst, paraded briefly through town. Women, on the other hand, were made examples, not because they posed a danger, but because they represented one. A woman who steps out of line, sexually, socially, spiritually, is a threat to the entire order. Because if a girl can say yes, maybe she can say no, and that's the real danger. You watch as the priest approaches the girl, muttering a prayer you can't hear over the jeers. He's not her confessor. You can tell by the way he looks at her, like she's a broken chalice instead of a person. He makes the sign of the cross, then steps back. Another cabbage flies, then a rock. She doesn't cry, not once. There's a scholarly debate about how often these punishments were used, and whether they were truly about justice or simply control. Some historians argue they were rare, reserved for extreme cases. Others say they were part of a larger pattern of social policing, where female sexuality was constantly surveilled, corrected, and punished. The truth probably lives in the stories that were never written down. The ones passed between women in hushed tones. The ones where names were forgotten but the warning remained. You step away, finally. You don't want to see more. But the image burns behind your eyes. Later that week, you hear someone say the girl's family sent her away. To a convent, maybe. Or further. You'll never know. She vanishes like a stain scrubbed from a tunic. But the lesson lingers. You walk differently now. Talk differently. You double-check your veil. Keep your voice lower when men are near. Smile when you don't want to. You teach your daughter, still small and unknowing, to sit with her knees together. To say thank you to older boys. To be polite. To be safe. As if safety is something you can earn by being soft enough, small enough, silent enough. But deep down, you know the truth. No girl is ever truly safe in a world where desire is punished and silence is prized. You lie awake some nights, staring at the ceiling, remembering the girl in the pillory. Not her name, not her crime, just her face, just the way she didn't flinch. And you wonder, if it had been you, would you have stayed that still? Would you have held your head up? Or would you have broken? The midwife's hands are stained with yarrow and soot, her fingernails trimmed short, her wrists knotted with veins like tree roots. You sit in her cottage now, low ceiling, thick beams, everything smelling of ash, garlic, and something bitter you can't quite name. She doesn't speak much, doesn't ask why you've come, just gestures to the stool by the fire and says, "You're not the first." That's all. You don't say the word. No one ever does. You talk around it like everyone else. You say you've missed your courses, you say your belly feels strange, you say you've been tired, faint, unlike yourself. You say nothing about the peddler who passed through weeks ago, nothing about the way his hand slipped under your apron like it was his to move. Nothing about how you didn't say yes, but didn't say no quickly enough, and how afterward he said you looked like a girl who wouldn't cause trouble. And maybe you're not, but you are here. Here's tonight's historical fact. While abortion was officially condemned by the church by the 13th century, there was a long period in the earlier medieval centuries when it was treated with more ambiguity, especially if done before quickening, the moment a mother felt the baby move. Some canon law texts equated early abortion with contraception, both of which were sinful, but not always considered murder. The moral line was blurry, the legal one even blurrier. But all of that means nothing to you, because where you live, sin is measured in suspicion. Law is whatever the priest mutters and the bailiff enforces. And the midwife? She's the only one who might help without questions. She brings out a pouch from behind a stone jar. Inside are dried herbs, tansy, pennyroyal, mugwort, and rue. Each has its own smell, bitter and sharp, like the way your mouth tastes when you wake after dreaming of that man's face. She hands you a cup of water, then begins grinding the leaves with a pestle. Fringe fact, many of these same herbs, used by medieval women to bring on the menses, are now known to have uterotonic properties, meaning they stimulate the uterus to contract. Some are dangerous, even toxic in the wrong dose. But women didn't always have the luxury of safe or gentle options. They had midwives, word of mouth, and prayer. You sip the tea slowly. It's hot, and the taste is awful. Bitter, metallic, earthy. You're not sure what's worse, the way it burns your throat or the way your hands tremble afterward. She gives you instructions. Lay low, keep warm, no heavy lifting, prepare for cramping, possibly pain, possibly blood, possibly nothing. No guarantees, just possibility. You ask what happens if it doesn't work. She looks at you with eyes like cracked stone and says, then you make another choice. She doesn't elaborate, she doesn't need to. There's scholarly debate around how widespread and effective these remedies really were. Some argue they were little more than folk magic. Others insist they were a vital part of women's medicine, passed down through generations with surprising accuracy. What's certain is that the knowledge existed, and it existed for a reason. Because women have always known what their lives are worth, even when no one else has. You go home aching, waiting. You don't tell your husband, of course. You don't even tell your closest friend. Not because you're ashamed, but because you can't trust anyone to keep quiet. And then it begins. In the early morning, pain grips your lower back like a claw. It comes and goes in waves, stronger than a monthly course, weaker than labor. You curl on the rush-stuffed mattress and press your face into the blanket, biting down on the wool. Hours pass like honey, slow, sticky, sickening. You feel the blood before you see it, warm, thick, unmistakable. It soaks the cloth you placed between your thighs and drips onto the floorboards below. You say nothing, you don't cry, you breathe. It goes on for hours, then stops. And just like that, it's done. Nothing is ever the same again. You bury the cloth deep in the garden, near the roots of the elder tree. You don't say a prayer. You just press the soil down with your hands, slow and deliberate. The dirt is cold. It takes your warmth and gives nothing back. Later, you sit at the hearth. The fire pops. Your husband is still asleep. The children are still dreaming. The world continues. No one knows what you've done, and yet everything inside you feels quieter, lighter, not healed, but less hollow. You've saved something, though it's not clear what. Your body, your sanity, your place in this world? Maybe all of it, maybe none. But here's what you know now. Women like you have always walked this path, silently, carefully, together, and yet alone. You think of how many others have sat on that stool in the midwife's house, hands shaking, hearts pounding, wanting not death but choice, not sin but survival. And you realize the oldest knowledge in the world isn't written in books or spoken from pulpits. It's whispered over boiling water, ground into powder, tied into bundles, slipped between fingers in the dead of night. And it's been kept alive not by the powerful, but by the ones with the most to lose. You look at the fire, the tea is still in your mouth, you swallow hard, and you decide, without saying a word, that this secret is one you'll guard with your life. You've learned to spot the signs, the tight-lipped glances exchanged at church, the way a midwife's hands still quietly tremble after a long labor, the flicker of dread behind a mother's smile when her daughter begins to bleed for the first time. You've learned that silence doesn't mean peace. It just means everyone's trying not to fall apart. But some things can't be silenced. You wake to screaming before dawn, not the sharp cry of a child with a bad dream, or even the low moan of a drunk collapsing into the street, but something raw, something torn from the belly of someone who's just realized the world won't be putting itself back together. The sound echoes down the lane, and you know, without needing to ask, that someone's child has died. By the time you reach the neighbor's house, it's already over. The door is open, wide and strange, like a mouth left agape after a final breath. Inside, it's quiet. Too quiet. A girl, 𝕬𝕚𝕚, barely 14, lies curled in the corner like she's trying to disappear into the floorboards. Her shift is soaked in blood. There's a midwife crouched beside her, but she looks lost, her hands still wet, her face the color of ash. You don't ask questions. You help clean the floor. You boil water. You hold the girl's hand even though she doesn't grip back. Later, you learn the rest. The baby came too early, or maybe it wasn't meant to come at all. Maybe it was never a baby, just tissue, blood, potential. There's no priest to declare it a soul, no record to mark that it existed, but you saw the blood. You heard the scream. You know what it cost. Tonight's historical fact. Infanticide and concealed births were not uncommon in medieval Europe. In many places, especially where unmarried motherhood was heavily punished, women who gave birth in secret and lost their infants, whether by accident or intent, faced the full weight of the law. Some were executed, others imprisoned, some vanished entirely. It was the crime no one admitted was common. Because who would want to admit it? The church insisted that all life was sacred, that the soul entered the body early, sometimes at conception, sometimes at quickening, depending on which bishop or philosopher you asked. But the law was harsher than theology. If a girl gave birth alone and the child didn't survive, the assumption was murder. Even if there was no proof, even if the girl never meant for it to happen. There's a fringe fact that gets buried in most histories. In England, a 1624 law declared that any unmarried woman who concealed the death of her newborn could be hanged unless she could prove it was stillborn. That law came centuries later than where you are now, but it reflected a sentiment already deeply rooted. Guilt by silence, guilt by fear. You help wash the girl. You whisper to her that she is not evil. You say it softly, without much hope that she believes you. She stares past you. Her lips are dry. You offer her broth, and she turns her head away. Later, the whispers begin. No one says what happened out loud. They just repeat her name with that edge. You know the one. You've heard it used on other women. Women who stopped bleeding after a stranger passed through town. Women who wore thicker skirts for months, then suddenly didn't. No proof, just knowing looks. There's a debate among scholars about whether medieval communities were merciless or simply trapped in the same fear as the women they punished. Some argue that these villages acted out of cruelty. Others say it was desperation, an attempt to enforce order in a world where chaos constantly lurked outside the door. You suspect it was both, because when food is scarce and plague always a season away, people cling to the illusion of control. And nothing disrupts that illusion faster than a girl who bleeds in secret and births in silence and emerges with nothing but a haunted stare. No one asks where the father is. They never do. You start to notice other signs now. A girl who winces when she bends to pick up a pail. A woman who rubs her belly with a look that's not quite grief. A midwife who tightens her jaw when asked why she keeps so much rue in her cupboard. And you begin to understand, survival isn't just physical. It's mental, emotional, spiritual, if you still believe in that kind of thing. These women are surviving, even when the village turns against them, even when the priest won't look them in the eye, even when their own mothers flinch when they enter a room. You sit by the fire that night, and you think about all the ways a girl can be broken without anyone laying a hand on her. All the ways a body can scream and no one listens. All the ways pain is swallowed and buried like a stillborn secret in the garden behind the house. But you also think about the women who show up anyway, with cloth, with herbs, with silence, with eyes that say, "You are not alone." And that, maybe, is the greatest rebellion of all. Not healing, not justice, witnessing. Because sometimes the only thing worse than what happens is pretending it didn't. So you hold the memory of 𝕖𝕡 tight, not to hurt her, but to make sure she doesn't vanish the way so many others have. You keep her name like a candle. You light it when you kneel at night. You whisper it into the wind. And you wait for the day your daughter is old enough to ask questions. Because when she does, you will tell her the truth, even the parts that hurt. You've started dreaming in Latin, not because you understand it, but because it's everywhere, in church, in the mouths of priests, stitched into the very rhythm of your days. You don't know what the words mean, not really. They roll over you like thunder in a foreign sky. Ave Maria, ora pro nobis, peccatum, corpus. The phrases linger, not as prayers, but as pressure, a kind of background hum of guilt, humming in your bones, even when you're just stirring porridge or wringing out linens. Religion has shaped everything around you. How you dress, how you speak, when you kneel, who you marry, and how many children you're expected to bear. It's the water you swim in, the weight you wear. And if you're like most girls in your village, you were taught very young that your body is both a gift and a threat. Sacred, but only when untouched. Dangerous, once desired. The church speaks often about purity. Virginity is prized, but not just for what it is. It's what it represents. Obedience, holiness, control. Because if your body belongs to God, then it certainly doesn't belong to you. Here's your historical fact. By the later Middle Ages, the ideal Christian woman was shaped more by the image of the Virgin Mary than by any living, breathing female. Mary, meek, obedient, miraculously pure, was lifted up as the model to emulate, which was unfortunate, since most real women could not count on divine conception to explain away an inconvenient pregnancy. Still, Mary stood as a symbol of female virtue, one impossible to live up to but mandatory to strive for. You remember the stories from childhood, how Eve brought sin into the world, how Mary redeemed it through silent submission. One woman damned humanity, the other saved it, not by fighting, but by accepting. There's not a lot of wiggle room between those two examples, so you learn to stay small. You confess things you're not sure are sins. You say sorry for the shape of your body. You sit through sermons where the priest rails against lust and never once mentions the men who cause it. When you get your first blood, your mother doesn't celebrate. It's more like a funeral for your girlhood. You're told to be careful now, as if your body is suddenly armed and liable to harm someone. The fringe fact? In some convents, young girls were married, yes, married to Christ. They took vows and wore veils. Some even had ring ceremonies, complete with bridal gowns. The church wasn't subtle. A woman's highest calling was submission to a man, even if that man was divine. Either way, you were expected to belong to someone. You wonder sometimes if Mary was ever lonely, or scared, or just tired of being held up like a banner over women whose feet were bleeding from walking the roads of real life. You don't blame her. You blame the ones who twisted her story into a leash. There's a scholarly debate about how much actual power the church wielded over the lives of medieval women, especially outside of noble or urban contexts. Some argue that village life followed its own rhythms, seasonal, practical, less doctrinal. Others insist that religion infiltrated every layer of daily existence, from childbirth rituals to marital consent to what herbs could be boiled without being accused of witchcraft. You think both are true. The church didn't have to be everywhere physically, it lived in your mind. It was in the glances, the rules, the things no one questioned. It was in the fear you felt the first time you enjoyed your husband's touch. Was that sin? Pleasure wasn't mentioned in the sermons, only suffering. And yet, despite everything, you still believe. Not in the angry God from the pulpit, or the sour-faced saints glaring from stained glass, but in something gentler, something older, a warmth behind the stars, a silence that listens when no one else does. You light candles at night, not because you think they erase your sins, but because the flickering makes your chest ache less. You hum hymns under your breath when the baby cries. You kiss the crucifix by your bed, not for forgiveness, but for comfort. You see faith in other women too, in the way the midwife prays before every birth, her hands coated in blood, in the way old Marta sings psalms while weeding her onions, in the way the widow Annalisa wears her cross sideways, like it's just as burdened as she is. Faith, in your world, is survival. It gives you something to hold when everything else slips away. But it's also a knife, and it's usually aimed at women. You don't get to ask questions, like why a girl who's raped still has to confess, or why your husband's temper is ignored while your tears are called hysteria, or why the priest warns you about being seductive, even though you've never dared to show your ankles in public. But some women do ask, quietly, carefully. There are midwives who refuse to call stillbirths punishments, nuns who write secret letters about divine love that sound suspiciously like desire. Even the priest's own sister once whispered, after 3 children and a broken hip, that maybe heaven was a place where no one needed your body. You hold those moments like scripture, and maybe that's the real gospel. Not the one written in books you can't read, but the one passed hand to hand between women. The gospel of endurance, the gospel of not going mad, the gospel of knowing you are not less than holy just because you've bled, desired, grieved, survived. You look up at the stars and say a prayer, not to the God in the fresco, but to the one who might be listening in the dark. The one who understands what it means to live in a woman's body and not break completely. Not yet, anyway. It's late summer now, that sweet golden rot season, when the air hangs heavy with ripening fruit and the promise of something dying just beneath the sweetness. The fields are fat, the wheat bending like women in labor, and the sun seems too bright, too close. You're sweating through your linen shift by mid-morning, but you keep moving, keep working, because that's what you've always done. Still, something about this season makes you feel off, restless. Like your body is a room you don't want to be in. Maybe it's your age. You're not old yet, not exactly, but you're not young either. You've bled long enough to count the cycles not in days, but in decades. You've buried 1 child, born 3 others, spent countless nights lying awake beside a man who breathes like a draft horse and never once asked if you liked any of it. And suddenly, you start to wonder, is this it? Is this what the rest of your life is meant to look like? Morning aches, cold porridge, the sound of chickens and children, and sermons on repeat until you die? You start noticing other women more closely. The older ones especially. The ones whose hair is gray and skirts are simple, who wear their opinions plainly and don't seem afraid of anything. They gather by the well in the mornings and speak without whispering. They tell jokes that make younger wives blush. They talk about blood, stopping, not starting, and one of them says, "Once it ends, the rest begins." You almost drop your bucket, because no one ever talks about that. Here's your historical fact. Medieval texts rarely mention menopause. It existed, of course, it always has, but the records focus far more on fertility, pregnancy, and virginity. Once a woman was no longer fertile, she was often culturally invisible. She became the background. Sometimes that brought freedom. Sometimes it brought suspicion. You feel both. At night, you lie in bed and wait for the bleeding that doesn't come. 1 month, 2, 3. And then, like a door creaking shut, it's just gone. At first you feel broken, like the machine inside you has jammed, but then something else creeps in. Relief. The kind that feels like guilt at first, because no one told you how much energy went into managing that monthly cycle, the endless calculations, the fear of conception, the quiet dread. Now, your body is still, not numb, not empty, just yours again. You're not alone. You hear whispers, old blood dried up, womb closed like a shutter. The older women laugh at it. They think we're useless now, one says, smirking. Just wait till they see what we know. Because here's the fringe fact. While society often tried to write post-menopausal women out of the script, many found a second life of power. With no risk of pregnancy and no household of infants to tend, some became midwives, healers, property managers. In certain communities, older women even held religious or folk authority, acting as community-wise women or go-betweens for disputes. You weren't young, you weren't invisible, you were other. And other could mean powerful, if you played it right. But power comes with risk. You know that. There's another word that starts to circulate once the blood stops. Witch. You've heard it muttered, not about you, not yet, but about Marta, who lives alone at the forest's edge and dries herbs no one else knows the names of. They say she talks to birds, that she helped a woman lose an unwanted child, that she knew about a death before it happened. It's always vague, always secondhand, but the suspicion is thick enough to taste. And here comes the scholarly debate. Were medieval accusations of witchcraft mostly about spiritual fears, or were they a way to punish women who stepped out of line? Most now agree it was about control. Midwives, widows, women who lived without male supervision, women who spoke too freely, who aged ungracefully, who knew too much. You look in the mirror, well, not a mirror exactly, but a polished pan in a basin of water, and try to see what they see. Lines at the eyes, new weight in your face, a stillness to your body that feels unfamiliar, not youthful, not crone-like, just other, like you're slipping into a new skin, one no one prepared you for, and yet something inside you stirs, something almost joyful, like a forgotten tool rediscovered at the bottom of a basket. You start to say no more often. No to your husband's fumbling hand when your body's tired. No to church gossip about girls who've lost their way. No to being small. And it feels dangerous, and it feels good. Because this new phase of life isn't marked by celebration. There's no feast for the last time you bleed. No blessing, no wreath of flowers. It just happens in silence. But it is a rebirth. Not into motherhood, not into virginity, into yourself. You see the older women now not as old, but as seasoned, as sharp. You understand the way they look at the world, like they've already survived the worst of it, like nothing anyone says can shake them anymore. You want that, you're becoming that. And though the village may not throw stones or whisper witch just yet, you prepare anyway. You start drying your own herbs. You listen when the birds go quiet. You trace the cycles of the moon with your finger on the windowsill, not because you're casting spells, but because you're paying attention to yourself, to your power, to the version of womanhood no one sings about, the one after the fire, after the blood, after the men have stopped looking. It's not the end. It's the beginning you weren't told was coming. You're standing at the edge of the village when you realize it. Nothing new is going to be given to you. No apology, no acknowledgement, no ceremony marking everything you endured. The world simply keeps going, as if your pain were just another season that passed on schedule. And somehow, that clarity feels steadier than hope ever did. You've lived long enough now to see patterns repeat. Girls bleeding for the first time with fear in their eyes. Mothers tightening their mouths because they know what comes next. Men laughing too loudly in taverns, confident the rules will always bend their way. Priests preaching restraint to women while excusing appetite in men. It's all painfully familiar. But here's what's changed. You no longer mistake it for inevitability, because you've survived it. And survival, you've learned, teaches a different kind of wisdom than obedience ever did. Tonight's historical fact brings us full circle. By the late Middle Ages, women's lives were changing, but not always in ways that felt like progress. Laws tightened around sexuality, church doctrine hardened, witch trials loomed on the horizon. In many regions, the fragile autonomy women once carved out through custom and community would soon be crushed under fear and institutional power. The window you lived through, narrow, imperfect, brutal, was also one of the last moments where women's informal networks still held real sway. You feel that closing now, even if you can't name it. The younger women come to you more often, not openly, not with declarations, but they linger. They ask questions sideways. They sit near you at church. They mention aches, worries, missed bleedings. You answer carefully. You don't tell them what to do. You tell them what exists. Knowledge, passed gently, without instruction. You've learned that telling a woman she has a choice is sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do for her, and the most necessary. There's a fringe detail historians love to debate, whether women like you saw yourselves as resisting anything at all. Some scholars argue that medieval women didn't think in terms of rebellion or oppression. Others say resistance doesn't require a manifesto, it just requires persistence. You lean toward the second, because nothing about your life felt theoretical. It felt immediate, physical, necessary. You didn't challenge the system with speeches. You challenged it by living, by helping when you were told not to, by knowing when you were told to stay ignorant, by choosing silence when noise would have killed you, and choosing speech when silence would have erased someone else. You think back to the girl in the pillory, to Aliette on the blood-soaked floor, to Clara's hand brushing yours in the herb room, to the bitter tea, to the widow's quiet smile, to the first time you said no and realized the world didn't end. These moments didn't change history, but they changed you. And maybe that's how history actually moves. Not with kings and wars and dates carved into stone, but with women quietly deciding not to disappear. You watch your daughter now, standing on the same threshold you once crossed without warning. You don't frighten her with everything. You don't lie either. You teach her to pay attention, to her body, to her instincts, to other women. You tell her that shame is loud, but truth is steady, that fear thrives in isolation, that she is not broken for wanting, questioning, or refusing. Will it protect her? You don't know, but you know silence didn't protect you. There's a scholarly debate, always another one, about what truly changed between the medieval world and the modern one. Some say things improved, others say the language changed while the power structures stayed stubbornly familiar. You've lived long enough to know this much. Every era tells women that things are better now, while asking them to endure quietly just a little longer. You don't believe that anymore. As the sun sets, you sit outside, feeling the ache in your knees, the calm in your chest. You've stopped measuring your worth by what your body can produce. You've stopped apologizing for taking up space. You've stopped waiting for permission. What was sex really like for medieval girls? It was confusing, it was frightening, it was sometimes tender, often painful, rarely explained, and almost never fair. It was wrapped in duty and silence and fear, but it was also negotiated, whispered about, managed, endured, reclaimed in fragments, and always, always, lived by real girls with real minds and real feelings, not the flat symbols history likes to remember. You were never just a victim. You were never just a body. You were a person navigating a world that refused to see you clearly, and you did it anyway. The world may not remember your name, but the women who came after you carry what you learned in their bones. And that, you realize, is how things change. So now you're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling beams, the same ones you've stared at for years, but somehow they feel different tonight. You've been through so much, not in the way men write down in battle scrolls or scrawl into law books, but in the quiet, everyday way that changes the shape of a soul. And if you've made it this far, if you're still breathing in a world that seems to forget women while simultaneously demanding everything from them, then maybe, just maybe, you've won more than anyone ever gave you credit for. You think back through it all. The aching uncertainty of girlhood, the silence wrapped around your own body. The first time your curiosity was punished. The first time your no didn't matter. The rituals, the rules, the looks. The love that wasn't safe, and the safety that wasn't loving. You remember the smells of sweat and milk and blood and bread, and the sounds of whispered warnings passed from woman to woman like smuggled gold. And you know now that survival was never about staying clean or perfect or obedient. It was about finding pockets of air in a world determined to keep you underwater. It was about the other women, always the women, who saw you when you thought you were invisible. It was about quiet rebellions, small kindnesses, and the courage it takes just to stay soft in a world that wants you hard or broken. You're not a saint. You're not a cautionary tale. You're not a statistic scribbled in a monk's ledger. You're just a woman. And that, in this place, in this time, was already a miracle. You pull the blanket up. Your knees ache. The fire's gone low. Outside, the wind moves through the trees like an old story retelling itself. Tomorrow, the world will still demand much from you. But for now, just for this moment, you let your eyes close, and your body rest, and your mind release the weight of being misunderstood. You made it, not untouched, but unerased, and that's enough.